Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever noticed something missing, only to find it's right where you left it, except it's not? That strange feeling, like the world is quietly slipping out of place, and nothing feels quite right. That's what I started to experience when I first noticed the money was gone. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, I thought it was just my mistake. I've been working as a cashier at a small local convenience store for a while, and like anyone, I occasionally forget things. I would swear I counted the bills right, but when I checked the safe at the end of the night, the total was off. Maybe a few $100s at first, nothing that would raise an immediate alarm. But over time, it started to happen more frequently. I thought I was just tired, maybe distracted, or even careless. But then I started noticing something odd. Every time I checked the cameras, there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. The footage would show me locking the safe, and the next thing I knew, the money was just gone. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication of anything unusual. The cameras were perfectly fine, nothing was recorded, nothing suspicious. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was a mistake, that maybe someone else was taking the money. I could even suspect a fellow employee, perhaps a casual mistake or even a slip of the mind. But it felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. The unease in the pit of my stomach grew stronger every day. One night, after closing, I decided to stay a little longer. I was going to get to the bottom of this. I sat at the back office, watching the security monitors and waiting, hoping for a clue, anything to show me what was really going on. The store was silent, the only sound the hum of the refrigerators and the occasional flicker of the fluorescent lights above. It was then that I saw it. The shadow. At first, I thought it was just the movement of the light, or maybe my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But as I stared, I saw it again, this time clearly. A shadow moving along the far wall of the store, just outside the camera's range. The darkness seemed to stretch unnaturally, like it was alive, moving with intent. The sound, a faint rustle, like something was sliding across the floor, followed by the softest of steps. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The air felt colder suddenly, the quiet of the store even more oppressive. I grabbed my phone, my hand shaking as I dialed the store manager. No answer. I tried again, panic setting in. But as I looked back at the monitor, the shadow was gone. The silence was suffocating. My eyes scanned the room, but nothing seemed out of place. I convinced myself it was nothing more than a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew I wasn't so sure anymore. The next morning, I opened the safe again. The same routine. And just like the night before, there was less money than I had counted. I glanced over at the camera feed. It was empty, just the usual footage of me locking the safe, and then the next moment, the money was gone. There was no explanation, no reason I could point to. Only that overwhelming sense of dread, growing stronger every time. That's when I realized something. The store wasn't just empty at night. It wasn't just me, alone in the dark. Something was watching, something was moving, and I had no idea what it wanted. Or worse, how it had been getting inside. The unease turned into full-blown fear as I began to hear things, small sounds in the night. The soft tap of shoes on the tile floor, the creak of the front door swinging open, and the whispers that echoed through the aisles when I was sure no one else was there. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't just losing money. Something was happening here. Something I couldn't understand. And every night, it felt like the shadows were closing in on me. The tension was building. Soon, I wouldn't be able to ignore it anymore. The nights became longer, the air thicker. Each time I walked into the store, it felt like the walls were closing in around me. The shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should, and the flickering lights only added to the sense of something lurking just beyond my line of sight. I couldn't trust myself anymore. I was sure the money was being taken, but the cameras showed nothing. I had even checked the safe again and again, trying to make sense of it. Maybe there was a flaw in the system. Maybe there was something wrong with the lock. But the security footage didn't show any sign of tampering. The doors were locked, the windows closed. Nothing was amiss, yet the cash continued to disappear. The more I watched the footage, the more unsettled I became. I had no idea what I was looking for, but I kept hoping the cameras would reveal something, anything. Then, one night, something did. I had stayed late again, watching the footage on loop, hoping that I could catch some sign of a person or an event that would explain the missing money. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something strange in the footage from the back aisle. A blur. A figure, but too fast to make out clearly. It moved with an unnatural speed, slipping from one spot to another in the blink of an eye. I felt a chill in my spine. I rewound the footage, watched it again and again. It wasn't just a person moving quickly, it was as if the figure was changing. Distorting, almost. The shape seemed to shift, elongate, and then shrink again. It was like it wasn't entirely solid. I pressed my hand to my mouth, trying not to breathe too loudly. What was happening? What was this thing? Why couldn't I see it properly? I grabbed my phone and texted the manager once again. No reply. Of course, he was probably asleep, but it felt like the walls themselves were closing in on me, pressing in from all sides. I turned the lights off, hoping it would help me think, but all it did was make the store feel even more suffocating. The shadows deepened, and the silence felt louder than it ever had before. I wasn't alone anymore. I knew it. Something was here with me, watching from the darkness. The camera feeds began to glitch. At first, it was just a brief flicker, like when a connection weakens. But then the glitches started to grow longer. The screen would go completely black, only for a few seconds, but each time it happened, my unease grew. It happened again that night. I was watching the screen when the monitor blinked out entirely. The store was pitch black, and I could hear a soft rustling in the distance, coming from the aisle closest to the safe. It was unmistakable, the sound of something shifting, moving. I should have left. I should have locked the doors and walked out, but fear kept me rooted in place. My feet felt like they were cemented to the floor, my hands trembling as I tried to control my breathing. And then, suddenly, the monitor came back to life. What I saw made my blood run cold. The figure was standing directly in front of the safe. Its face was distorted, like it had been stretched or blurred beyond recognition. The outline was humanoid, but the details weren't right. The way the shadows clung to it, wrapping around its limbs like they were part of it, everything about it was wrong. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was watch as it slowly reached out, its hand hovering over the safe, as though it was waiting for me to stop it. But I couldn't. My body was frozen, unable to do anything but watch as the thing drew closer. The sound of its breath, if it even breathed, was the only thing I could hear. It was ragged, like something was suffocating within it. A deep, wheezing rasp, almost like it was struggling to keep itself together. And then, just as it reached out, the camera flickered again. When the image cleared, the figure was gone. I immediately stood up and checked the safe. My heart pounded in my chest. The money was gone. Not just a few $100s this time. The entire night's earnings vanished. But when I checked the footage, it was all gone too. There were no shadows, no figures, no trace of what had happened. Only me, staring blankly at the safe, the camera recording an empty store. I checked the lock. It was secure. The doors were locked. No one had been inside. Yet the money was gone. Again. I was losing my mind. I had to be. It was the only explanation that made sense. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe the stress was getting to me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my mind. Something, or someone, was doing this. And I had no idea how to stop it. The next few days felt like I was stuck in a nightmare, the kind where you wake up and think you're safe, but the world outside the dream is twisted beyond recognition. The store, my sanctuary, was no longer a place of simple work. It had become a battleground, a place where I fought against an unseen force that seemed to know me better than I knew myself. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. Everywhere I went, the shadows followed. At night, they seemed to stretch longer, as if reaching toward me, beckoning me to step into their embrace. The rustling noises, faint at first, had grown louder, more distinct. At times, I thought I could hear whispers, soft voices murmuring just out of earshot. I turned, but there was nothing there, just the emptiness of the store. I'd started taking precautions. I would check the cameras obsessively, making sure the doors were locked, the safe secure. But every night, the same thing happened. The money would vanish, and the cameras would record nothing. There was no sign of a break-in. No hint that anyone had entered the store. But the shadows were still there. Moving. I started to lose track of time. My once reliable routine, open the store, count the cash, make sure everything was running smoothly, had become a blur of anxious moments. I found myself staring at the walls, waiting for something to happen. My mind raced, piecing together the strange events. Every night, I felt a little more lost, a little more out of control. And then one evening, as the last of the daylight faded, something changed. I was finishing up my shift, the store almost empty. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the quiet ticking of the clock, everything seemed normal for once. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Maybe tonight the strange occurrences would stop. But then I heard it. A soft scraping sound coming from behind me. I froze. It wasn't a normal sound. It was deliberate, like something or someone was trying to get my attention. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly turned to face the noise. Nothing. The aisle behind me was empty, the shelves undisturbed. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. But it wasn't like the others. This one was moving, slowly, toward me. It was humanoid, tall, with long, ragged limbs. It crawled, dragging itself across the floor, its form bending and shifting as it moved. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was watch as it inched closer, its form stretching in unnatural ways, its edges dissolving into darkness, like it was made from the very shadows themselves. I should have run. I should have screamed. But I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the thing that was coming closer with every passing second. And then, just as it was within arm's reach, I saw it. A face, horribly distorted, its features a blur of dark shapes, like something that wasn't meant to exist in this world. Its eyes, empty voids, stared straight through me, into me, as if it could see everything I had ever done, every thought I had ever had. It didn't speak, but I could hear it. Its thoughts, its intentions, invading my mind. And then it spoke, but not with words. I felt it in my head, a terrible, suffocating pressure, as if my mind was being crushed beneath the weight of its presence. "You're not alone," it whispered, not with sound, but with sheer force, an overwhelming presence that left my ears ringing. "You've never been alone." The words echoed through my mind, over and over, as it reached out a hand toward me. Its fingers were long and twisted, like broken branches reaching for my throat. I snapped out of my stupor. I didn't think, I just reacted. I turned and ran, my feet pounding the cold floor, my heart thundering in my chest. I could hear it behind me, dragging itself, scraping across the floor with an eerie, deliberate pace. I didn't dare look back. I ran to the back room, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it, breathing heavily, my body shaking uncontrollably. The store was silent now. Too silent. I slowly turned to face the darkened room. It felt wrong. Something was off. I was no longer alone. I could feel it, its presence in the air, pressing against me. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling, but the screen was blank. The battery was dead. I tried to charge it, but the outlet sparked and fizzled as if it was refusing to work. It was as if the very space around me had been altered, changed, in ways I couldn't understand. I had to get out. I had to leave, but the doors wouldn't open. The lock wouldn't turn. I could hear the scraping again, now coming from every direction. I was trapped. The shadows were everywhere, and they were waiting for me. The store, once familiar, now felt like a labyrinth. Every corner I turned, the walls seemed to shift, as if the very space around me was alive and twisting. The ceiling stretched higher, the floor seemed to sink lower, and the aisles, they weren't the same. The shelves I had worked with for years were now foreign, their products different, their labels unrecognizable. I tried to breathe. I tried to steady myself. But I couldn't. The air was thick, heavy, as though I was suffocating on my own fear. The scraping sound was still there, but it was no longer just from behind me. It was everywhere. Above, below, around me. It felt like the shadows had eyes, thousands of eyes, that were watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I couldn't stay in the back room forever. I had to find a way out. I glanced at the door again, the one that had failed to open, the one that felt like it was mocking me. Desperation clawed at me, and I tried again. I twisted the doorknob with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, darker, curling toward me like tendrils, pulling me back. "You're not leaving," a voice whispered from somewhere in the room. It was the same voice, the one I had heard in my head earlier, but this time it was clear. Distinct. It came from the shadows. I took a step back, heart racing. "WH, what do you want from me?" My voice cracked, sounding weak even to myself. The voice answered, but not with words. The shadows swelled, rushing toward me, surrounding me, until they were all I could see, all I could feel. They were cold, unnatural, and they seemed to press against me, suffocating me with their weight. I stumbled backward, feeling the walls close in on me. The store, the whole building, felt alive. The floor beneath me seemed to pulse, thumping with the rhythm of my heart. It wasn't a place anymore. It was a trap. I had to escape. I had to get out before it consumed me completely. I forced myself to turn away from the door. My eyes darted to the small back window. I could see the faint glow of streetlights outside, but the shadows, those thick, oppressive shadows, blocked my way. They were crawling up the window, like fingers gripping the glass, preventing me from even seeing what was beyond. I couldn't breathe. Panic rose in my chest, threatening to drown me. But then, in the midst of my fear, I heard something new. It was soft at first, a faint whispering, but then it grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from behind the shelves, from the farthest corner of the room. I crept toward the sound, despite every instinct telling me to turn and run. There, in the dim light, I saw something. A shape, hunched over, moving slowly. It was human, but not quite. Its form was distorted, its limbs too long, its back arched at an unnatural angle. It crawled like a creature from some twisted nightmare. And then it turned its head. I froze, my blood running cold. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were hollow, black voids, endless and empty. They stared at me, unblinking, as if it knew me. As if it had always known me. The whispers grew louder. They weren't just words anymore. They were feelings, thoughts, images, things I hadn't seen, things I hadn't known, yet somehow they felt familiar. You've always been a part of this place, the voice spoke, not in my head, but from the thing, the figure in front of me. You were never meant to leave. I staggered back, my body trembling, my mind racing. My thoughts were unraveling, spiraling into madness. How was this happening? How was it even possible? This couldn't be real. This had to be a nightmare. A bad dream I could wake up from. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, the store, the shadows, the figure in front of me, none of it felt fake. It felt alive. I turned and ran again, not knowing where I was going, not knowing if there even was an exit. The store's aisles twisted before me, the lights flickering, the walls warping. The shadows reached for me, crawling up my legs, tugging at my clothes, pulling me into the darkness. The whispers were everywhere now, filling my ears, my mind, suffocating me with their words, their thoughts. Stay, they urged. Stay with us. It's too late to leave. I screamed, but it didn't matter. The sound was swallowed by the store, devoured by the shadows. Suddenly, I stumbled. My foot hit something. I looked down to see that the floor had changed. The tiles, once familiar, white and clean, were cracked, broken. The walls were smeared with something dark, something that didn't belong. I wasn't just in the store anymore. I was somewhere else, somewhere that had never existed before. The figure was behind me now, crawling closer. I could hear its breath, shallow and ragged, as it dragged itself toward me, its fingers scraping the floor. I couldn't escape. The shadows were everywhere. I couldn't see, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I was suffocating in this place, this twisted version of reality. And then, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It wasn't mine. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the darkness. And I realized, too late, that I was no longer alone. The hand on my shoulder lingered for a moment before fading into the darkness, leaving a cold, numb sensation behind. I stood still, my heart pounding in my chest, unable to move. The air felt thicker, more oppressive, and I could hear the sound of my own breath, ragged and uneven, echoing in the space around me. The whispers had stopped. The silence was louder than anything I had ever experienced, deafening in its emptiness. But then, just as suddenly, the whispers returned. This time, they were clearer, more insistent, as if they were speaking directly to me. "You don't belong here," the voice hissed, a cold, mocking tone. "But neither do you belong anywhere else. You were never meant to leave." I stumbled forward, desperate to escape the weight of the words, to flee the place that had become a prison. But no matter how far I ran, the walls and aisles twisted and stretched, trapping me in an endless loop. My legs were weak, my thoughts clouded with fear and confusion. Nothing made sense anymore. The store had become a maze, an endless cycle that I couldn't escape. The figure was closer now, its distorted form emerging from the darkness. It moved faster this time, its limbs snapping and cracking as it approached. Its eyes, hollow and endless, seemed to burn into me, filling my mind with images of things I couldn't understand. I ran again, but this time the floor beneath me shifted. The ground cracked open, and I found myself falling, plummeting into an abyss of darkness. My body twisted and turned as I fell, the wind rushing past me in a cold, mocking howl. I could feel the presence of something ancient, something hungry, closing in around me. The shadows stretched toward me, like fingers reaching from the void. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, I stopped falling. My body slammed against a hard surface, and I gasped for air, disoriented and trembling. I opened my eyes, but everything was still dark. The familiar hum of the store, the flickering lights, the creaking of the floorboards, it was all gone. I was in a void, a place with no sound, no color, no time. "You're still here," the voice said, its tone almost amused. "You never left." I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, held by an unseen force. I could feel the presence of the figure again, its cold breath against my skin. It was so close, I could feel its fingers brushing against my neck, its twisted body looming over me. "You're part of this place now," the voice whispered. "There's no way out. There's only staying. Forever." Terror seized me as I realized the truth. There was no escape. The store, the shadows, the twisted figure, they were all part of this place. A place that existed outside of time, outside of reality. And I had been pulled into it, trapped by the very thing I had feared most. The figure leaned in closer, its breath cold and ragged against my ear. I could feel its weight pressing down on me, its presence filling every inch of the empty space. "Make your choice," it said, its voice low and guttural. "Stay with us, or disappear." I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know what was real anymore. The store, the shadows, the whispers, they were all merging together, becoming one with my mind. My thoughts were slipping away, lost in the overwhelming darkness. But I had a choice. I always had. The figure's words echoed in my mind, "Stay, or disappear." I closed my eyes, trying to focus. My heart was still racing, my body trembling, but deep inside, I knew there was something I had to do. In the end, it wasn't a question of escaping. It was a question of surviving, of holding onto myself long enough to make it out. I didn't know what would happen if I stayed. I didn't know if I could ever leave. But I knew I had to try. I focused all my energy on the one thing I knew for sure, the one thing that was real, my will to survive. And with that thought, I opened my eyes, and everything went silent. The store, the figure, the darkness, it all vanished in an instant. For a moment, I thought I was free. I thought I had escaped. But when I looked around, I found myself standing at the front of the store once again. The aisles were back to normal. The shelves were filled with products I recognized. The lights were flickering, just as they always did. But there was something wrong. The air was still thick with tension, and the shadows seemed to move even though there was no one else in the store. And then I saw it. The safe. The door was open. The money was gone. It all began with a simple question, one that didn't make sense at first. But then, like a spark in a dark room, it lit up my mind with unease. Did you get my note? It was the first message I received, as innocuous as it seemed. I should have never replied, but I did. I should have never acknowledged the presence of that note. But curiosity got the best of me, and so I opened it. It was short, neat handwriting. I'll leave it at your desk, just as always. K. That wasn't unusual. But what unsettled me was the timing. My colleague, K, had been on vacation for over a week. He'd left the office, headed to some remote island, as he'd told us. I had seen the photos, heard him talk about the blue waters and the warm sun. So why was there a note on my desk? I looked around the office. No one else was there yet. The air felt heavy, like a storm was building up in the quiet. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, and the hum of the machines felt distant, like a memory. I was the first to arrive that morning, the office still and undisturbed. Yet, there was just a single note left on my desk. A chill ran down my spine. How could K have left it? He was thousands of kilometers away. I picked up the note. The ink was fresh, not faded at all. It was clear, legible, as if written minutes before. My mind raced. Had I been imagining things? Or had I simply missed him somehow? The doubts started to creep in. Maybe it was a joke, a prank. But no, that wasn't like K. He wasn't the type. Then again, I didn't really know him that well. A thought lingered, pressing against the back of my mind. What if I wasn't as alone as I thought? I walked around the office, checking the door, the windows, the empty desks. Everything was where it should be, but the weight of something unseen pressed down on me, and my heart beat faster. At that moment, I heard a faint sound, a soft scuffle, as if something had been dragged across the floor. It was distant, maybe from the hallway or somewhere deeper in the building, but it was there, undeniable. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The note, was it a sign of something more? I walked back to my desk, staring at the piece of paper. I couldn't bring myself to sit down. Not yet. Was I overthinking this? Maybe it was just the beginning of a new workday, but that one question, the question that had opened this chain of events, kept echoing in my mind. Did you get my note? I turned around again. The hallway behind me remained still, but somehow it felt wrong. My hand shook slightly as I reached for my phone. I checked the time, wondering how much of the morning had passed. It wasn't long before I heard a sound, faint, but it was there again. This time, it was closer, coming from the break room down the hall. I wasn't alone, and the realization hit me like a cold wave. If Kay was on vacation, then who had left the note? I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. The building was old, and old buildings had creaks and groans. The walls shifted, the floor settled. But the sound, it wasn't the usual. It wasn't the soft side of the building. It was deliberate, like someone or something moving around. I swallowed hard and stood still for a moment, listening. The scuffling sound grew louder, closer, then stopped altogether. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel my pulse racing, each beat heavy in my chest. I turned slowly, my feet dragging unwillingly, as if my body was urging me to move, but my mind told me to stop, to wait. I glanced at the note again. "I'll leave it at your desk, just as always. Kay." Was this some twisted game? If it was a cruel one. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't trust my own reasoning anymore. What if this wasn't a game at all? What if something else was at play? I didn't want to go down that road, but the unsettling reality crept into my thoughts like a shadow. I shook my head and walked towards the hallway, slowly. My shoes clicked sharply against the tiled floor, each step echoing louder than the last. I reached the break room door, my hand hovering over the handle. The door was ajar, just a sliver, barely wide enough to peer inside. The scent of stale coffee and something metallic filled the air. I pushed the door open just enough to get a glimpse. No one was inside. Nothing moved. The chairs were neatly arranged, the table spotless. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something on the table. A second note. It was identical to the first one. Same neat handwriting. Same ink. My stomach dropped. I didn't pick it up immediately. Something in the room felt off, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't quite place it, but the air was different, thick with a kind of tension that made it hard to breathe. My eyes flicked around the room, but there were no shadows, no figures hidden in the corners. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stepped closer, hesitant but driven by a need to understand what was going on. The note was just as the first, written recently, crisp and clean. There was no way Kay could have written it, not with the distance between us. And yet, it felt like I was being pulled deeper into something I didn't understand. I took a deep breath and picked up the second note. "Did you get my note?" it said. The words were identical, yet there was something about the repetition, the insistence in the question, that made my hands tremble. I stared at it, trying to make sense of it. The room felt colder now, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. My breath fogged in the air. That's when I heard it again, the soft, dragging sound, this time unmistakably coming from just behind me. I spun around, but the break room was still empty. There was no one there. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my breath hitched. I had to leave. I had to get out of here. I turned and walked quickly to the door, my footsteps echoing in the silence. But as soon as I stepped into the hallway, I froze. The hallway was darker now. The overhead lights flickered briefly before returning to their usual dull buzz. I looked around, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The hallway was still empty, but somehow it felt different, like it was stretching further than before. Like the walls were pressing in on me. I didn't know where the feeling came from, but I had the distinct impression that something was wrong. Very wrong. That's when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible shuffle coming from behind one of the office doors. I couldn't see anyone, but the sound was unmistakable. It was slow, deliberate. I took a step forward, then stopped. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but it felt like the temperature was dropping even more and the walls seemed to close in tighter. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't define. I glanced back toward the break room, but now it was as if the hallway stretched on forever, the break room too far to reach in one step. There it was again, the shuffle. Closer this time. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned, slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. And then I saw it. A shadow. But it wasn't cast by anything I could see. It was like the shadow was there before the light even touched it, a dark figure moving against the grain of reality. A figure that should not have been there. I gasped, my breath catching in my throat. The figure seemed to move toward me, but it didn't have a shape, no distinct edges, no features. Just darkness, swirling, stretching toward me. The shuffle came again, louder now, as if something was walking closer, just out of sight. The air grew heavier, thick with the feeling of something ancient and wrong. And the shadow continued to approach, its form shifting, expanding. I could feel it, closing in around me. I backed away, but the hallway stretched longer with every step I took, the sound of footsteps coming from every direction now. The shuffle. The shadow. I was no longer alone. I stumbled backward, my hands reaching for the wall, trying to steady myself. But the wall seemed to shift beneath my fingers, the smooth surface suddenly rough, jagged, as though the building itself were warping around me. The shadow loomed closer. It had no shape, no distinct features, but it was there, looming like a void in the otherwise quiet, sterile hallway. The temperature continued to drop, and my breath came in visible clouds, each exhale hanging in the air for longer than it should. The shuffle grew louder, more pronounced, like slow, deliberate footsteps. I spun around, my eyes frantically scanning the hallway, looking for the source of the sound. There was no one. No one at all. Yet the steps continued. I could feel it, the presence. Something was behind me, just out of reach, pressing in from all sides. My heart raced, the panic rising in my throat. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It felt like the very air was closing in on me, suffocating me. And then, a voice. Did you get my note? It wasn't loud, but it was clear. It was the same words as before, but now they echoed in my head, reverberating like a drumbeat, a rhythmic pulse that grew louder with every repetition. My hands trembled as I pressed them against my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it didn't work. The voice was in my head, inside my skull, as if the question were embedded in my very thoughts. I didn't know where it was coming from. It wasn't coming from behind me or from the hallway. It was coming from everywhere. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, it felt like the building itself was speaking. I looked around in a panic, trying to make sense of what was happening. The hallway stretched on infinitely now, the doors and offices blurring into one long, dark corridor. The shuffle of feet was deafening, and yet the hallway remained eerily still. Then I saw it. A figure stepping out of one of the offices. Slowly, methodically. It was the shape of a man, but it wasn't Kay. It wasn't anyone I knew. It was a shadow, dark and amorphous, moving with unnatural precision. It wasn't just walking. It was gliding, as if the air itself were bending to carry it forward. It moved closer. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was rooted to the spot, my body frozen, caught between the desire to flee and the impossibility of escaping. I felt the presence of the figure as if it were pressing against my skin, its gaze. I could feel its gaze, though I couldn't see its face. The voice came again. Closer this time. Did you get my note? I wanted to answer, but the words wouldn't come. There was something inside me, something deep down, that told me not to speak, not to acknowledge it. But I couldn't help myself. My lips moved against my will, whispering, yes. The figure stopped. It was just out of reach, but the presence was suffocating, overwhelming. I could feel it in my chest, pressing against my heart. The question echoed once more, louder this time, booming inside my skull, shaking me to the core. Did you get my note? My eyes blurred, and the world around me began to distort. The hallway bent and twisted, the walls pulsing with a rhythm that matched my racing heartbeat. The figure moved again, slowly, creeping toward me, its form shifting with each step. I backed away, my legs trembling. But there was nowhere to go. No escape. The figure loomed closer, its shadow growing longer, its presence more suffocating. And then it spoke, its voice no longer just a whisper, but a low, guttural growl. You didn't get my note, did you? The world around me spun, the edges of my vision growing dark, the presence overwhelming. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My mind was on fire, every inch of me screaming to wake up, to escape, but there was no waking up. No escape. The figure reached out. Its hand was a dark blur, a shadow, but its touch felt real, cold, ice cold, as if it were made of pure darkness. Did you get my note? It asked, its voice now a harsh rasp. The words drilled into my mind, repeated over and over, each one a hammer blow against my consciousness. I couldn't answer. I couldn't do anything. The figure was upon me now, its hand gripping my arm, cold as death. I could feel its fingers digging into my skin, its touch burning, as if the darkness itself was consuming me. And then, everything went black. For a moment, I thought I had lost consciousness. But when I opened my eyes again, I was no longer in the hallway. I wasn't in the office at all. I was in a room, a dark, empty room. The walls were black, the air thick with a heavy silence. I couldn't tell where I was, but I knew one thing, I wasn't alone. There was a note on the floor, just in front of me. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the handwriting. It was the same. Did you get my note? The words burned into my mind. The question seemed to stretch, to echo through the space, growing louder with each passing second. And then I realized. I had never left the office. I had never left the hallway. The note, the voice, they were all part of something much bigger, something far more terrifying. And I was trapped. I scrambled to my feet, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I reached for the walls, trying to steady myself. The darkness in the room felt oppressive, pressing against my skin, tightening around my chest. I had to move, had to find a way out. But there was no door, no windows, no escape. The room was cold. Too cold. My breath came out in invisible clouds, and I could feel the air biting into me, gnawing at my skin like tiny shards of ice. The silence was deafening, stretching out into eternity, but beneath it, there was a subtle hum. A low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The note sat on the floor in front of me, taunting me. Its ink glinted in the dim light, the words almost mocking in their simplicity. Did you get my note? The same question, repeated like a chant, an incantation. It was the only thing in the room that made sense, the only thing that was real. I took a step back, my eyes darting around, searching for something, anything that could explain this nightmare. But the room was featureless. No furniture, no doors, just the suffocating blackness. And the note. Always the note. The shadow, the figure, had vanished, but its presence still lingered, thick and heavy, like a fog that refused to lift. I could still feel it, pressing on me from all sides, lurking just beyond my vision, waiting. Did you get my note? The voice came again. This time it was different. It wasn't the growl of before. It was calm, almost gentle, as though speaking directly into my mind. The words didn't come from any direction, they simply appeared inside my thoughts, as if they had always been there, waiting for me to notice them. I pressed my hands to my ears, desperate to block it out, but it didn't help. The voice was inside me now. The words were a part of my very thoughts. There was no escaping them. I could feel my mind slipping, unraveling, caught in a loop of endless repetition. The question, the note, the voice, it was all connected, tangled together in a web that I couldn't escape from. The hum in the air grew louder, more insistent, vibrating deep inside my chest. The room began to warp again. The edges of the walls flickered, like a bad signal on a television. The darkness was no longer a solid thing, it was moving, flowing, shifting in unnatural ways. The space itself seemed to bend and twist, like the very fabric of reality was being stretched and pulled apart. I had to get out. There had to be a way out. I turned, desperate now, searching for something, anything, that might lead me to freedom. My eyes locked onto the note again. It seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, as if it were beckoning me closer. I didn't want to touch it, but something in me urged me to do so. A force stronger than my own will pushed me forward, making my hand reach for the note, as if it were an extension of myself. As soon as my fingers brushed the paper, a shock of cold ran through me, coursing down my arm and into my spine. The room seemed to collapse inward, the walls closing in. The hum grew louder, vibrating through my bones, until it felt like the very air was alive with static. And then, everything stopped. Silence. The air was still again. The coldness had lifted, but only for a moment. I stood there, frozen, holding the note in my hand. My breath was ragged, my pulse hammering in my chest. The darkness still pressed against me, but now it felt different. It wasn't as suffocating. There was something else in the room now. Something new. Something that wasn't there before. A presence. A watchful eye lurking just behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. The room was empty. Still. Silent. But I could feel it. The hum was gone, but the presence remained. It was in the air, in the space between the walls, between the shadows. It was waiting. And then I heard it again. Did you get my note? This time, the voice wasn't in my head. It was right behind me. I turned. There, standing in the center of the room, was the figure. The shadow. But it was different now. It wasn't just a shifting, amorphous shape. It had form, vague, indistinct, but real enough to be terrifying. The figure was tall, towering over me, its presence dark and unnatural. It had no face, no features, just an empty void where a face should be. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. It moved toward me, its movements slow, deliberate, like it was savoring every second. "Did you get my note?" it asked again. The voice was no longer calm. It was demanding, insistent, as though the question was more than just a question. It was a command. A plea. I couldn't answer. I didn't know how. The figure was so close now. I could feel its coldness seeping into me, draining the warmth from my body. It was like I was becoming part of it, merging with the darkness. The figure reached out, its hand stretching toward me. The touch was like ice, freezing my skin, my bones. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. The shadow had me in its grip, and I was powerless to escape. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The room was empty again. But I wasn't alone. The note was still in my hand, but it had changed. The words had shifted. Now, they were written in jagged, uneven letters. "You didn't get my note." The air grew heavy again, thick with the weight of the words. The darkness seemed to pulse, like a heartbeat, rhythmic and steady. And I realized, too late, that I had never been in control. The note, the figure, the voice, they were all part of something I couldn't understand. A force beyond me, beyond reason, and now I was part of it. There would be no escape. The presence was inside me now, and I would never be free again. I stood there, trembling, clutching the note in my hand as if it were the only thing holding me together. My breath was shallow, my chest tight. The words on the paper were burned into my mind, the jagged letters flashing in front of my eyes. "You didn't get my note." The room seemed to grow darker again, more oppressive, as if the very air was thickening around me. I felt the weight of something unseen pressing down on me, suffocating me, urging me to look at the note one more time. My hand shook as I raised it, my eyes unwillingly scanning the words again. But something was different now. The note was no longer just paper. It felt alive, pulsating in my hand, as if the words themselves were breathing, feeding off my fear. The ink writhed, twisting, blurring before my eyes. It was as if the note was changing, adapting to me, to my mind. I could feel it in my bones, the presence. It was closer now, filling every corner of the room, every shadow. I couldn't see it, but I could sense it, closing in like a storm, its energy crackling in the air, heavy and electric. And then, the voice came again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a question anymore. It wasn't even words. It was something deeper. A sound, a vibration that felt like it was coming from inside me. My skin prickled, and my mind screamed for escape, but there was nowhere to run. No place to hide. "Did you get my note?" This time, the words didn't just fill my thoughts. They shouted. They rumbled through me, reverberating in my chest, in my soul. The voice wasn't asking anymore. It was demanding, clawing at me, pulling me deeper into its grip. I didn't know how much time had passed. Minutes? Hours? The room had stopped existing. The walls, the floor, the darkness, it all blurred together into one suffocating mass of nothingness. The only thing that remained was the question. The note. Did you get my note? It was impossible to think, impossible to focus. My mind was trapped in an endless loop, replaying the same question over and over again, twisting like a dagger inside my skull. I couldn't remember what had come before. I couldn't remember how I got here. All that remained was the note. And the figure. I felt it before I saw it. A weight on my chest, a coldness creeping into my bones. The figure was there, standing just out of sight, just behind me, its presence as palpable as the air itself. I didn't need to see it to know it was there. I could feel it, its cold fingers wrapping around my heart, squeezing until I couldn't breathe. The voice whispered again, this time directly in my ear. "Did you get my note?" I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the note up, to throw it away, to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't do anything. My body was frozen, my mind trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I could feel the figure moving behind me, its presence pressing closer, but I couldn't look. I couldn't turn around. My mind screamed at me to escape, but my body betrayed me. It wouldn't move. It couldn't move. "Did you get my note?" The question repeated itself, louder now, each time more insistent. It echoed in my head, in my bones, in the very air around me. It was all-consuming, devouring every thought, every shred of resistance. There was no room for anything else. Just the question. Just the note. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, constricted, as if something were choking me from the inside. The figure was close now. I could feel its presence in my spine, its fingers crawling up my neck, cold and clammy. "Yes." I whispered, the words escaping my lips before I could stop them. The room fell silent. The coldness that had been pressing against me receded, just slightly, as if the figure was considering my answer. But it wasn't done. It wasn't finished. There was something more. The darkness swirled around me, and the note in my hand crumpled, the words twisting and distorting, bleeding into one another. They blurred into shapes I couldn't comprehend, forming into new patterns that made my eyes ache. And then, the question came again. "Did you get my note?" It wasn't a question anymore. It was a command. It was all there was. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the note in half, burn it, erase it from existence, but the more I fought, the more it consumed me. The more it whispered, louder, louder, until there was nothing but that single, endless question. And just before everything went dark, just before I disappeared entirely into the void, I realized something. There had never been a choice. There had only been the note, the figure, the question. And now, there would only be the answer. Yes. Have you ever looked into a mirror and felt something was wrong? Not just the normal unease we sometimes get from seeing our own reflection, but something more sinister? Something that feels out of place, like it's watching you, waiting for the moment you look away? I never believed in those things, ghosts, shadows, the stories people tell when they feel alone or scared. I always brushed them off as silly fears, something that belonged only to the movies or nightmares. That was before I saw it. It started one evening after work. I had just moved into this small, quiet apartment. The kind of place that's nothing special, barely furnished, a little too dim in the hallways, and quiet in a way that makes you think a little too much. But I didn't mind. After the noise and stress of the office, the silence felt like a blessing. I needed it. I deserved it. That evening, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing my teeth, lost in thought. The mirror was old, the glass slightly clouded with age, but still clear enough to reflect my image in it. As I reached for my toothbrush, I noticed a movement in the reflection. It wasn't much at first. A brief shift, like the air had stirred behind me, or perhaps the light had caught the glass in a way that made the shadows move. But then, I saw it again. This time, clearer. A figure. A shadow moving slowly behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, toothbrush still in hand. I couldn't move my eyes from the reflection. There it was, unmistakable, a dark shape walking across the room in the mirror. I could see the outline of a person, tall, thin, and moving toward the bathroom door. I turned quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one there. The small bathroom was empty. No figure. No shadow. Just me, standing by the sink, my reflection still staring back at me, confused. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. It was nothing, I told myself. A trick of the light, maybe. I turned back to the mirror. My reflection was exactly the same, still me, standing in the same place, holding the toothbrush. But the feeling didn't go away. The weight of something being wrong lingered in the air, thick and heavy, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on me. I shook it off again. I was just tired. I hadn't been sleeping well, and the apartment still felt unfamiliar, like I was still getting used to it. Maybe I had imagined it. But later that night, as I lay in bed, trying to sleep, I kept thinking about it. The movement in the mirror. The way it had been so real, so clear, but when I looked around, there was nothing there. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I rolled over, pulling the blanket tighter around me, but the room felt colder than it should have been. The silence seemed to stretch longer, as if the night was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the apartment. That something was watching me. I forced myself to close my eyes, to push the thought out of my head. And yet, the reflection haunted me. Every time I glanced at the mirror, it seemed to call out to me. Not with words, but with something deeper. A pull. A question. What had I seen? Was it real? Or was it just my mind playing tricks on me? But no matter how many times I told myself it was nothing, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Something was lurking behind me in the reflection, and every time I turned, it was still there, waiting. The question kept echoing in my mind. What if the mirror isn't showing you what's really there? What if it's showing you something else entirely? And as I lay there, staring into the darkness, I knew one thing for certain. I had to find out. Because whatever it wasn't just a trick of the light. It was something more. And it was waiting for me to look again. The next morning, I tried to push the thoughts away. The sunlight filtering through the curtains, the sounds of distant traffic outside, all of it was normal, familiar. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. There was no need to worry about what I had seen the night before. After all, mirrors could play tricks, right? Still, as I passed the bathroom door on my way to the kitchen, I couldn't help but glance toward the mirror. I quickly looked away, shaking my head, trying to convince myself I was being irrational. There was nothing there. Nothing at all. But as I stood at the kitchen counter, preparing a cup of coffee, I heard it. A faint noise. A whisper. At first, I thought it was the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, the way it sometimes does when you're nervous or anxious. But then it came again, soft but distinct, like a faint rustling of fabric. I turned my head, my gaze involuntarily drifting back to the bathroom. The door was ajar, the mirror just visible through the crack. I held my breath. There was no one in the bathroom. I could see that much from where I stood. Yet, as I stared at my reflection in the glass, something was wrong. The angle was off. The reflection wasn't showing me standing in the kitchen. No, it was showing me still in the bathroom, just as I had been the night before. And there, behind me, was the figure again. It moved across the room, slow and deliberate, its outline faint but clear in the mirror. It was the same shape I had seen before. I froze, my body stiffening with fear. My heart raced, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I quickly turned around, expecting to see something, anything, behind me. But once again, there was nothing there. The room was empty. No shadow. No figure. I stared at the empty space, my breath shallow and quick. What was happening? Was I going insane? I forced myself to step forward, my legs unsteady as I approached the bathroom door. With each step, the whispering seemed to grow louder, more insistent. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling. I pushed the door open. The bathroom was exactly as it should be. No figure. No movement. Just the sink, the mirror, and the cold, silent air. I glanced at the mirror once again. It was empty. Just my reflection. But I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. The figure had been there. I had seen it clearly. I wasn't imagining it. And yet, there was no explanation. No trace of it now. The reflection was just mine, as it should be. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. Had I imagined it all? I took a shaky breath and backed away from the mirror. There had to be some rational explanation for this. There was no such thing as ghosts or whatever that thing was. I went back to the kitchen, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavier now, as though the space itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. I tried to focus on my coffee, but my hand shook so badly that I spilled some of it onto the counter. The cup rattled as I set it down. I quickly wiped up the mess, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the mirror. What was happening to me? Why couldn't I explain what I had seen? I forced myself to eat breakfast, to move through the motions of a normal morning. But the entire time, I couldn't stop thinking about the mirror. I couldn't stop thinking about it. As I walked past the bathroom once more, I glanced toward the mirror. And that's when I saw it again. This time, the figure didn't move. It just stood there. Still. Watching. Its shape faint but undeniable, just behind me, just beyond the reach of my awareness. I could feel its presence even before I fully turned around. But when I spun on my heel, the room was empty. There was nothing behind me. Nothing at all. Except the mirror. And my reflection. But in the stillness, I heard it. The soft rustling again. This time, louder. Closer. I didn't dare turn back. I couldn't. I was starting to realize something. The mirror wasn't just reflecting me anymore. It was showing something else. Something I couldn't see with my own eyes, but it was there, in the reflection. And now, I couldn't tell if I was looking into the mirror or if the mirror was looking into me. The question lingered in my mind, gnawing at me. Was I losing myself? The fear was becoming too much to bear. But I couldn't stop myself from moving closer to the bathroom. I had to face it. whatever this was. I reached out for the doorknob again. I turned the knob, my fingers slick with sweat, my heart pounding. The door creaked open slowly, almost in warning. The bathroom lay in front of me, the familiar shapes of the sink, the toilet, and the shower all standing still in the dim light. But the mirror was the only thing that wasn't still. I hesitated at the doorway, feeling a cold chill creeping over me, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The mirror, that accursed mirror, was reflecting something else now. It wasn't just the faint shadow I had seen before. No. This time, the reflection was clearer. The figure was standing right behind me, too close for comfort. Its outline was more defined now, and I could see the texture of its shadow, the way the light shifted around it. The figure seemed tall, unnaturally tall, and its movements were wrong. It didn't move like a person should. It was stiff, jerky, its limbs twitching with unnatural precision. I didn't need to turn around. I could feel its presence at my back, creeping over me like a cold, suffocating fog. In the reflection, I saw the figure's head tilt. Its eyes. I couldn't see them, not clearly, but I could feel them. It was watching me, studying me, as if it were waiting for something. My breath caught in my throat, and I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But my legs refused to move. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my gaze locked on the mirror. I could hear it now, soft, low, almost a whisper. A sound that came from the figure in the reflection. A voice, but not one I could understand. It sounded like a hiss, like something wrong. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, hoping to shut it out, hoping that when I opened them again, it would be gone. But it wasn't. When I opened my eyes, the figure had moved closer in the reflection, now only inches behind me. My blood ran cold, my heart thundering in my chest. It was too close. Too real. The whispering grew louder, more frantic. It wasn't just a hiss anymore. It was like the figure was calling to me, trying to get my attention. But how could I respond? How could I even move? I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was tight, constricted. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. The figure's presence, its eerie stillness, held me in place like a trap. And then, in that reflection, I saw something that made my blood freeze, its hand, rising slowly, impossibly slowly, as if it were stretching out toward me. I blinked, and in that instant, it was gone. The hand, the figure, the cold presence, it all vanished, just as if it had never been there. The mirror reflected nothing but me, my own tired face staring back at me. But the silence, the unease, it didn't go away. I turned around, my body shaking, my heart racing. There was nothing behind me. The room was empty, the bathroom as normal as it had been. No figure. No movement. I breathed a sigh of relief, but it was shallow, and my body was still frozen, gripped by the fear that hadn't fully left. The whispering had stopped, but I could still feel it. The figure was still there, in the reflection, waiting, watching. It was waiting for me to look again. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't leave the bathroom. I couldn't go back to the kitchen or the bedroom. I had to know what it was. I had to understand why it was in the mirror. Why it was following me. I took a deep breath, my hand trembling as I reached out to the mirror again. I had to face it. I had to know what this was, what this thing was that had been haunting me. I placed my palm against the cool surface of the glass. And then, the whispering started again. It wasn't just a voice. It was a feeling now, like a pressure in the air. A weight pressing down on me. I could feel the figure in the mirror growing stronger, its presence swelling with each passing second. And just as my heart skipped a beat, the reflection shifted again. I saw myself in the mirror, standing there, my hand on the glass, but behind me stood the figure. This time, it was no longer just a shadow. It was there. Flesh and bone. A real person. Its features were twisted and unfamiliar, its face a blur of darkness. It was staring directly at me, and the whispering had stopped. The reflection was moving, but not in the way a reflection should. It was moving with me. My hand still pressed against the mirror, I saw the figure raise its own hand, as if mirroring my movements. But it wasn't my reflection. It was the thing. And then it spoke. Its voice was deep and hollow, like an echo from a place far beyond the mirror. Why do you resist me? The words felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. My breath caught in my throat. I staggered back, but my reflection in the mirror didn't follow. It stayed there, staring at me. And the figure's hand, still raised, slowly began to reach for me, the fingers stretching towards the glass, like it was trying to break through. I knew then, this wasn't just a reflection. It wasn't just a trick of the light. The mirror was showing me something else. Something that didn't belong in the real world. And that thing in the mirror, it wasn't going to let me go. The last thing I saw before I turned and ran was its hand, pressed against the glass, reaching for me. I ran. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in quick, shallow gasps as I fled from the bathroom. I didn't dare look back. The feeling of its hand, its cold, unrelenting presence, was burned into my mind as if it were still reaching for me. I bolted out of the bathroom, through the narrow hallway, and into the living room. My legs were trembling, unsteady beneath me. I needed to escape, but the apartment felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The silence in the air was deafening, suffocating. I threw myself onto the couch, my eyes darting around the room, expecting to see the figure from the mirror materialize behind me at any moment. But there was nothing. Only the quiet hum of the apartment. It was so still that it felt unnatural, as though the entire world had paused just to watch me. I could still hear the voice, the words echoing in my mind. Why do you resist me? I clutched my head, trying to push the thoughts away, but they wouldn't leave. The whispering, the feeling of being watched, it was all still with me, pressing down on me, suffocating me. It felt like it was in the very walls of the apartment, like it was part of the air I breathed. I thought about leaving, running far away. But where could I go? How could I escape something that existed inside the very reflection of the world? I glanced toward the bathroom door, where the mirror still stood, silent and still. I could feel its presence, like an invisible hand reaching out from across the room. But I couldn't go back there. I couldn't face it again. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then they went out completely, plunging the apartment into darkness. Panic surged through me. I scrambled for my phone, praying that I hadn't let it slip from my grasp in the chaos. I found it, my fingers shaking as I turned on the flashlight. The beam of light was weak, barely cutting through the dark, but it was enough to reveal the outline of the room. My breath caught in my throat. In the reflection of the darkened window, I saw something moving. It was the same figure from the mirror, standing in the reflection just behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. There was nothing there, no shadow, no movement. I took a shaky step back, my pulse racing. The light from my phone cast weak beams of light across the room, but every corner felt alive with something unseen. It was like the darkness itself was watching me. I turned back toward the bathroom. The reflection was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, waiting. Don't go back, I told myself. Don't look again. But I couldn't stop myself. My feet carried me toward the bathroom door, as if something invisible was pulling me closer. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling. The door creaked open slowly, and the cold air from inside hit me. I stepped inside, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There it was. The mirror. But this time, it wasn't the same. The reflection was different. The figure was no longer standing still. It was moving, jerking, twitching as if it were struggling to break free from the glass. I could see its hands pressed against the surface, trying to pull itself out of the mirror. It was closer now, almost too close to the glass, and I could feel its presence, its weight pressing down on me, even though it was trapped behind the mirror. My heart raced in my chest, and I stepped back, but my feet felt heavy, as though they were glued to the floor. The figure's face, that twisted, dark silhouette, turned toward me. It didn't speak this time, but I could see it now, clearer than before. Its face was contorted, its features distorted and wrong, like something pulled from a nightmare. Its eyes were black voids, like endless pits, and I could feel them pulling at me, drawing me in. And then, it did something I hadn't expected. It smiled. The smile was cold, cruel, and utterly inhuman. It twisted at the edges, like something alive inside the glass was trying to break free, to get to me. In that moment, I knew. It wasn't just watching me anymore. It was waiting for me to let it out. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. The thing in the mirror wanted to come through. It wanted to be free. And it was no longer just a reflection. It was real. I ran again, but this time it wasn't enough. The space around me seemed to bend, to twist. The apartment, once familiar and safe, had become a maze of shadows and silence, a cage I couldn't escape. I could feel it, now. The figure wasn't just in the mirror. It was in the walls, in the very air. And I was running out of time. I reached the door, my fingers fumbling with the handle. But before I could turn it, I heard the sound. A soft crack, followed by a sharp, hollow sound, like glass breaking. I turned around in horror. The mirror was cracking. The figure inside it pressed against the glass with both hands now, its face contorted into an expression of grotesque hunger. The cracks spread, spidering across the surface, and I knew it was coming. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't escape. And then, just as the mirror shattered completely, I heard it clearly. The voice, deep and hollow, like an echo from somewhere far beyond. I'm here. And the darkness closed in. I staggered back as the mirror shattered. Glass fell in shards around me, glittering like broken promises on the floor. The air was thick with the scent of cold metal and dust, but there was something else, something foul. The thing that had been in the mirror was free now. I could feel it, the air around me thickening, pressing in from every direction. My eyes darted to the broken mirror, but there was nothing left. Only jagged edges, the remnants of what had once been a reflection. but the feeling didn't leave. I turned toward the door, my body moving on autopilot. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here anymore. But as I reached for the door, I stopped. There was something behind me. I didn't need to turn around. I could feel it, like a shadow creeping up my spine, cold and unyielding. The whispering started again, soft at first, like a breath on the back of my neck. But it grew louder, more frantic, until it was all I could hear. It wasn't a voice anymore. It was a presence, filling the room, crushing me under its weight. I slowly turned. There, in the place where the mirror had once been, stood the figure. But it wasn't in the mirror anymore. It was standing there, flesh and bone. Its limbs were long and thin, twisting in unnatural angles, as if its very body were bending to fit some horrific shape. Its face. I couldn't make out the details, but I could feel its eyes, those endless, bottomless pits of darkness, staring into me, pulling me into its void. The smile was gone, replaced by something worse. A hollow, gaping mouth, wide and hungry. The thing was alive, and it was here, in the room with me. I backed away, my legs too weak to run, but my body screaming for me to flee. Every inch of my skin was crawling. I could feel the thing in the room, the air thick with its presence, like it was filling the space, consuming everything around me. And then it moved. Not like a person, but like something alive, something other. It didn't walk, it glided, a slow, unnatural motion that made my stomach churn. Its body jerked with spasms, as if it were barely held together. Its fingers, long and grotesque, reached toward me. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran out the door, down the hallway, toward the stairs. My feet pounded against the floor, but the sound wasn't right. It was muffled, as if the building itself was swallowing the noise. I burst through the door to the stairwell, my chest tight with fear, my heart racing. The stairwell was cold, damp, the walls lined with shadows that seemed to move as I passed. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. Every step felt like it was taking me further from the thing, but also closer. It was everywhere. It was following me. I reached the ground floor, my body trembling with exhaustion. The front door was just ahead. Freedom was just a few steps away, but even then, I could feel it. The thing. It was close. I threw open the door and stepped out into the street, but the world felt wrong. The air was heavier, thicker than it should be. The buildings around me seemed to loom like silent sentinels, watching me. I could feel it. The pressure was mounting. The world was closing in. And then I saw it. It was standing in front of me, blocking my path. It wasn't in the mirror anymore. It wasn't in my apartment. It was standing there in the real world, its twisted form a silhouette against the dim streetlights. The thing in the mirror had followed me. I froze, my legs giving out beneath me. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away, but there was nowhere to go. The streets were empty. The air was still. And all I could hear was the whispering. The thing stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring each step, each moment. "You should have left me alone," it whispered, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. My breath caught in my throat. My vision blurred, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I had gone insane, if everything was some twisted dream. But no! This was real. The thing reached for me. Its fingers, like broken branches, outstretched, coming for me. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the inevitable. And then, nothing. I opened my eyes. The street was still. The thing was gone. The silence stretched out in every direction, suffocating me. But something was wrong. The absence of the thing, its presence, left a hollow space behind it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the thing wasn't gone, it had just retreated. And somehow, in some twisted way, I knew this wasn't over. It had only just begun. As I stood there in the cold, dark street, I felt it. The cold fingers of dread creeping up my spine, curling around my throat, tightening with every breath I took. The mirror had shown me something I wasn't supposed to see. And now, it would never let me go. Have you ever had the feeling that something isn't right, even when everything seems perfectly normal? That nagging sensation, like a chill running down your spine, but you can't quite put your finger on it? I've been a taxi driver for over 10 years, and I thought I'd seen it all. I've had all kinds of passengers, drunk ones, quiet ones, chatty ones. People come and go, and I usually forget about them the second I drop them off. But there's one passenger that I can't seem to forget. It started about 3 weeks ago. Every night, like clockwork, at exactly 12:30, my phone would buzz with a request for a ride. It was always the same, no matter the weather, no matter how busy the night was, this one man would call for a taxi. The route was always the same too. He never spoke a word to me, not a single syllable. He would get in, sit in the back seat, and stare out the window. At first, I didn't think much of it. People have their routines, I thought. Maybe he was just someone who worked odd hours. But then, something strange happened. The first night, we drove through the city like any other ride. It wasn't until I reached his destination that I started to feel a strange unease. He never told me where to go, but I knew the area he wanted. Or at least I thought I did. He'd always get out at the same spot, an old, abandoned building near the edge of town. It wasn't on any main street, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The lights were always off, and there was no sign of life anywhere. I'd park at the curb, and before I could even turn around to ask him if he was sure this was the place, he opened the door, step out, and vanish into the shadows. I thought it was strange, but maybe he was one of those loners, someone who just liked being alone in the middle of nowhere. But then it started happening every night. The same time, the same route, the same stop. No conversation, no changes. Just silence. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I decided I would follow him. I wanted to know where he went after he got out of the car. So, I parked further down the street, out of sight, and waited. It was a cold night, and the wind howled down the alleyway. My eyes never left the spot where he had stepped out of the taxi. The minutes stretched on, my breath fogging up the window as I sat there, waiting. And then, I saw it. A flicker of movement, just beyond the corner of the building. I blinked and leaned forward, straining to see. But there was nothing there. Only darkness. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, but still nothing. I sat there, trying to make sense of what I had seen, but the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. I was sure I had seen something, just a glimpse, but it had been there. I waited for another few minutes, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I drove off, shaking my head, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. The next night, he called again. It was the same as before. No words, just the usual stop. But this time, I decided I wasn't going to just let it go. I couldn't explain why I felt so unsettled by this one passenger. Maybe it was the way he never spoke. Maybe it was the eerie quiet that surrounded him. Or maybe it was the fact that I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong about the whole thing. I dropped him off at the same spot again, but this time I followed him. I parked a little further down the street, just like last time, but this time I kept my eyes fixed on the spot where he disappeared. He got out, as usual, and started walking toward the building. I waited for him to vanish into the shadows, but this time I didn't look away. I watched him walk, his figure disappearing into the darkness. But then something happened. I heard it. A faint sound, a click. Like someone was watching me. I turned quickly, but there was no one in sight. The street was empty. Silent. My heart began to race. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I waited for what felt like hours, my eyes darting around, trying to make sense of what was happening. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I decided to leave. But as I pulled away, I noticed something. The building, that old, abandoned structure, was gone. It wasn't there anymore. I blinked in disbelief, my foot slamming on the brakes. The street was empty, the building had vanished, and I had no idea where it had gone. I drove back to the same spot, where I had dropped him off just minutes earlier, but there was nothing there. No sign of the building, no sign of the man. Only darkness. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The whole thing felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just stumbled into something that I wasn't supposed to know. The next night, the call came again. Same time. Same route. And I knew, deep down, I had to know where this was all leading. But a part of me also knew that I might not like the answer. And so, I drove again. The following night, I found myself behind the wheel again. I told myself I was just going to follow the routine, drop him off, and drive away, nothing more. But that nagging feeling, the one that told me something was wrong, wouldn't leave. It was like a constant pressure in my chest, squeezing tighter with every minute that passed. At exactly 12:30, the call came in. I didn't even have to check the name, I already knew it was him. The route was always the same, and every part of my body tensed as I began the drive. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. There had to be an explanation. But deep down, I knew something was off. I had felt it for days. When I arrived at his usual pickup spot, he was already waiting. His figure emerged from the shadows of the street corner, tall and thin, his face still obscured by the darkness. As always, he climbed into the back seat without a word, and I began to drive. I stole a glance at him through the rearview mirror. He didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, as if he was lost in thought. The silence between us was suffocating, and I couldn't help but wonder where he was going this time. The stop was always the same, but I couldn't shake the thought that tonight would be different. Something was going to happen. The road stretched on, and the familiar landmarks passed by, but the atmosphere in the car felt heavier, more oppressive. It was as if the world outside had grown quieter, as if the night itself was holding its breath. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my back. I drove for what seemed like hours, my mind racing, trying to make sense of the situation. Where was he going? Why did he never speak? Why did he always disappear into that strange, empty spot? And why did it feel like I was being watched? As I reached the end of the route, I prepared to turn onto the street that led to the abandoned building. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, my heart skipped a beat. The man was gone. I slammed on the brakes, my breath catching in my throat. I quickly glanced at the back seat, but there was no sign of him. Just an empty seat, staring back at me. I swore I had seen him sitting there just moments ago. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen or what I hadn't seen. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking as I tried to calm myself. I took a deep breath, trying to shake the panic that was building in my chest. Maybe he had gotten out earlier than usual. Maybe he was standing somewhere ahead, waiting for me. But when I looked, there was no one. No trace of him. The street was completely deserted. I checked the time, 12:55. It had only been a few minutes, but it felt like an eternity. My mind was spinning. What was happening? How could he have just disappeared like that? I got out of the car and walked to the spot where I had dropped him off the night before. I felt stupid, walking around in the dark, searching for something I couldn't explain. But my instincts told me I needed to find out what was going on. My heart was pounding in my chest as I reached the empty lot. The building was gone. The same empty space, the same eerie silence. The entire block was barren, as if nothing had ever existed there. My breath came out in shallow gasps. It was like the building had never been there, like it had vanished into thin air. I walked around in a daze, trying to piece together the fragments of what I had just witnessed. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But something deep inside me knew that wasn't true. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here anymore. My hands were trembling as I got back into the taxi and started the engine. But just as I was about to pull away, something caught my eye. A figure. It was standing at the end of the street, just outside the reach of the streetlights, barely visible in the darkness. The same tall, thin silhouette. But this time, I could see his face. The man. But something was wrong. His face wasn't right. It was as if it was shifting, changing, like it didn't quite belong. His eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to pierce through me, and I could feel them. They were watching me. Before I could react, he stepped forward, vanishing into the shadows. I slammed the car into reverse, my foot shaking as I tried to move away from the dark figure, but the road stretched on before me. No matter how fast I drove, the streets seemed to go on forever. It felt like I was trapped in a loop, caught in something I couldn't escape. The buildings around me began to blur, twisting and bending, as if the world itself was distorting. Every turn felt like I was driving further into a place I didn't recognize, a place that didn't feel real. The lights flickered and went out, and the only thing that remained was the suffocating silence. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to stop, to make sense of what was happening, but I couldn't. I didn't know how long I drove like that, through empty streets, past twisted shadows, trying to find my way out. But when I finally stopped, I realized something. I was back at the same spot. The same intersection. The same abandoned building. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there he was. Sitting in the back seat, as if he had never left. But now, his eyes were open. His eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, stared back at me through the rearview mirror. I couldn't look away. I wanted to, but it felt like something was holding me there, frozen in place. The same man, the same figure, the same passenger that had been in my cab countless times before. But something was different now. Something was horribly wrong. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. My heart pounded in my chest, a constant thud in my ears. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but my eyes kept darting back to the mirror. His gaze seemed to penetrate me, reaching into places I didn't want to explore. For a moment, I thought maybe I was just losing my mind. That I had driven too long, worked too many nights, and had begun to imagine things. But then I looked at the clock on the dashboard, 12:32. The time was right, but I knew something else was horribly off. I should have been miles away from here by now. The city was supposed to be behind me, not right in front of me, as if I had never left. I slammed the car into park, my breath coming out in shallow bursts. I turned around quickly, but the back seat was empty. It was just the same dark, lonely interior that I knew so well. Had I imagined it? Was I just seeing things? No. I couldn't deny it anymore. I had seen him. I had felt him. Something was happening. And it wasn't just my imagination. The silence in the cab was suffocating. The air felt thick, pressing in from every side. I felt the sweat trickle down my spine as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. I wasn't sure if I had been driving for hours or if time had just stopped altogether. The night felt endless. It felt wrong. I glanced in the rearview mirror again. This time, I was ready for it. I wouldn't let myself be fooled. But there, in the reflection, I saw the same figure. He was sitting in the back seat again, his eyes fixed on me. His mouth was slightly open, but there were no words. No words. I felt a chill spread through me, colder than the night air outside. My breath caught in my throat. I glanced over my shoulder quickly, but the back seat was empty. The silence returned. I turned the key in the ignition, desperate to get away from whatever this was. I wasn't sure where I was driving, but I didn't care. I needed to leave, to escape this night that had become something out of a nightmare. But the moment I pressed the gas pedal, the world outside shifted again. The streets began to blur, the lights growing dimmer, the buildings distorting into strange shapes. The city wasn't the city anymore. It was something else. Something unfamiliar. I could feel my pulse quicken as I drove faster, hoping that maybe, just maybe, if I kept moving, things would go back to normal. But it wasn't normal. Nothing was normal anymore. Then, I heard it. A soft sound, like a whisper, coming from the back seat. I whipped my head around, my eyes searching the empty seat. But there was nothing. Just the same hollow silence. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flicker of movement in the rearview mirror. The man was there again. This time, his face was clearer, more distinct. His skin was pale, almost deathly white, and his eyes, they were wide open, unblinking. His mouth began to form words, but no sound came out. His lips moved, stretching, but the only thing I could hear was the pounding in my head. I slammed my foot on the brakes, sending the car screeching to a halt. My heart felt like it was going to explode in my chest. I turned to look again, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but the back seat was still empty. I was losing my grip on reality. The world around me was falling apart, and there was no way out. My mind raced as I tried to comprehend what was happening. The man, the passenger, wasn't real. He couldn't be. He couldn't just vanish every time I turned away. But there he was, every time, in the reflection. I reached for the door handle, my hand shaking, but before I could open it, the cab lurched forward, as though something was pulling it. The engine roared to life on its own, and the car began to drive again, taking me down roads I didn't recognize. The darkness outside pressed in, swallowing the streets whole. I tried to turn the wheel, but it was as if I no longer had control. The car drove faster, and I realized I wasn't driving it anymore. Something else was in the driver's seat now, something that wasn't human. I looked back at the rearview mirror once more. The man was still there, but this time his face was different. His mouth was wide open now, a grin stretching unnaturally across his face. And then, the whisper came again. "You can't escape." The words were clear this time. My blood ran cold, and I couldn't breathe. I tried to scream, but my voice was gone. The road ahead grew darker, more twisted, and the buildings that lined it seemed to lean in closer, their windows like black, empty eyes. I didn't know where I was anymore. I didn't know if I was still in the city or if I had crossed over into something else entirely. The only thing I knew for sure was that I was trapped in this night, in this endless loop. And the man in the back seat, he was still there, watching. Waiting. I wasn't sure what he wanted, but I knew one thing. I couldn't get away. The car kept driving, and I kept staring into the rearview mirror, where his grin widened. And then, just before everything went black, I heard it. A voice, coming from the shadows. "You're one of us now." And that's when I finally understood. I had become part of the night route. The world went black for a moment, but I was still aware of everything. The hum of the engine, the faint squeak of the brakes, the oppressive silence that enveloped the car. I couldn't move. My body felt like it was glued to the seat, unwilling to respond. But I could still hear the voice from the shadows, the one that had spoken those chilling words, "You're one of us now." I didn't know if I had truly passed out or if I had been asleep. Everything felt hazy, as though reality was slipping through my fingers. The lights of the city flickered briefly, like stars in the night sky, only to fade again into the blackness. The car kept moving. And that voice, it lingered. A soft whisper, always in the back of my mind, clawing at my thoughts. "You're one of us." I struggled to breathe, my chest tight, my heart racing. One of us? What did that mean? Was I dead? Was this some kind of punishment? Was I being dragged into a nightmare I couldn't escape? I forced myself to look up, but the road ahead was dark, empty. The streetlights were few and far between, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. I couldn't remember driving down these roads before, couldn't place any of these unfamiliar landmarks. It was as if I had driven into another world entirely. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, expecting to see the man, the passenger, sitting behind me, but instead, all I saw was darkness. Nothing. It was empty. Just a reflection of my own face, pale, wide-eyed, staring back at me in disbelief. I felt a sudden surge of panic. I reached for the door handle again, my hand trembling, but before I could open it, the car veered off the road with a sharp turn. I was thrown sideways, gripping the seatbelt to keep from crashing into the door. The engine roared louder, almost as if it had a life of its own. The car sped faster, swerving dangerously from side to side. I slammed my foot on the brake, but it was useless. The brakes didn't respond. The steering wheel jerked in my hands as if it were being pulled by some invisible force. The car was no longer in my control. I screamed. I pounded the dashboard with my fists, but nothing worked. The car kept moving, faster, faster, as the night around me grew darker. The buildings, those twisted, monstrous buildings, loomed closer, their windows like gaping mouths, watching me. Then I heard it. The whisper. Again. You can't leave. I looked into the rearview mirror, hoping to see something, anything, that would explain what was happening. But this time, I didn't see the man. Instead, I saw myself. Or what looked like me. The reflection was twisted, distorted. My face was drawn and pale, my eyes wide with terror, but there was something wrong with it. The reflection's eyes weren't mine. They were black, empty voids, and the corners of its mouth curled into a smile that was too wide, too unnatural. It wasn't me. I recoiled, my breath catching in my throat. My hands were shaking, my entire body trembling in fear. I tried to look away, but the reflection wouldn't let me. It stayed there, staring back at me with those dark, hollow eyes, its smile growing wider with every passing second. The car jolted forward, throwing me against the seat. I couldn't think, couldn't process what was happening. My heart was a drumbeat in my chest, each thud pounding louder than the last. The reflection, no, it was moving now, its mouth stretching wider, closer. No, no, no! I slammed my hands on the steering wheel, desperately trying to regain control, but it was too late. The road ahead had disappeared completely, leaving nothing but blackness. I couldn't see anything anymore. It was as if the car was driving straight into oblivion. And then, suddenly, the car came to a halt. Everything went silent. The engine cut off. The air in the car felt colder, heavier. The shadows outside pressed in closer, and I felt the weight of something watching me. My hands were still gripping the wheel, but they felt stiff, like they didn't belong to me anymore. My body didn't feel like mine. I looked up, my breath catching in my throat. And there he was. The passenger. Not in the back seat. Not in the reflection. He was standing in front of the car. His face was too pale, too still, like a corpse that had been left out too long. His clothes were torn, and his eyes, those empty, black eyes, were fixed on me. He didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel the weight of his gaze, like he was pressing down on me from every direction. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. And then, slowly, as if the very air around him was bending to his will, he began to step toward me. One foot forward. Then another. He moved like liquid, slow and deliberate, his gaze never leaving mine. Each step sent a ripple through the air, as though the very fabric of reality was warping around him. No. No, please. I tried to scream, but my voice was gone. The moment his foot crossed into the car, the world went dark again. I wasn't sure if I had passed out or if it was all just some terrible dream. But when I opened my eyes once more, I was back on the same road. The same route. The same endless night. And he was still there. The passenger. Staring. Waiting. And I knew, then, that I would never escape. I was part of the night route now. The world felt different now. It wasn't just the darkness that surrounded me, but the weight of it. The heaviness in the air. It was as though I was suffocating, but not from lack of oxygen. No, it was the suffocation of knowing I was trapped. Knowing that this endless night was no mistake. This was my new reality. I blinked, trying to focus, but the streetlights flickered above, like dying stars that were slowly losing their last moments of light. I was still in the driver's seat, still staring ahead at that same stretch of road. The passenger, he was gone. For now. But I knew he was out there. Somewhere. I took in a shaky breath, my heart hammering in my chest. The car had stopped on its own, and I was no longer sure of anything. What had happened? Was it all real? Was I dreaming? The silence was thick now, so heavy that it felt like it could crush me at any moment. The kind of silence that screams, "You're not alone." But it wasn't a comforting feeling. It was the silence of something waiting, watching, and preparing for the next move. I glanced at the rearview mirror once more, my hands trembling. The reflection was the same. Empty, quiet. No sign of the man. But deep down, I could feel him. I could feel his presence, like a shadow lingering just outside my line of sight. I started the car again, the engine sputtering to life, its hum the only sound breaking the silence. But the road, it hadn't changed. The same long, lonely stretch of asphalt. No buildings, no signs, no turn-offs. Just the road ahead, disappearing into nothingness. I drove. There was no other choice. I had to keep moving. It was the only way to make sense of any of this, even if it made no sense at all. The miles stretched on, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The road should have been ending by now. The streetlights should have led somewhere, to a town, to a familiar place. But there was only darkness. Only the never-ending stretch of pavement. No turn, no exit. Just him. And then I saw it. A flicker of movement in the distance. A figure. It was the man, the passenger. No, not just him. There were others. Figures scattered along the sides of the road, their forms half hidden in the shadows, their faces obscured. They were watching me. I could feel their eyes, all of them, on me. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. What was happening? What were they? Who were they? I tried to speed up, hoping to outrun whatever this nightmare had become, but it didn't matter. The road didn't change. The figures didn't disappear. They just kept watching, getting closer, their steps silent but inevitable. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, heart pounding. He was back. The man. His hollow eyes were locked onto mine, not in the reflection, but in the back seat. He was sitting there now, so close, so impossibly close. His face was inches from mine, but his lips didn't move. He didn't need to speak. I could feel his thoughts invade my mind. "You're one of us now," he whispered, his voice low and cold. I shook my head, my breath coming in ragged gasps. No, this isn't real. This can't be real. But it was. I slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt. The figures outside stopped in their tracks, and the world went eerily still. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was frozen in place, unable to escape, unable to breathe. And then, as if the universe had decided to show me the truth, the car doors opened. The man didn't move. He simply reached out with his cold, pale hand and beckoned me to follow. I wanted to scream, to fight, but the words wouldn't come. My body was no longer my own. I was a puppet, controlled by something far more powerful than fear. The door opened wider. The world outside was so dark now, the figures just silhouettes, their faces hidden in shadows. I knew what I had to do. I knew that there was no escaping this. I had become part of the night, part of the road, part of whatever this thing had planned for me. I stepped out. The cold air hit me like a wall, and for the first time, I saw them all clearly. The figures, the eyes, the faces, twisted and hollow, staring at me as though they were waiting for me to join them. "Welcome," the man said, his voice a low growl. I stepped forward, and as I did, I felt the ground beneath my feet disappear. The road stretched out forever, and with every step I took, I felt myself sinking deeper into the darkness. I had become one of them. The world around me vanished. The car, the night, everything faded away into blackness, and I was left, trapped in the endless void of the night route. Have you ever wondered what happens when someone simply disappears? One day, they're there, and the next, they're gone, without a trace. It's as if the world just decides to forget they ever existed. And yet, their belongings remain, as if mocking the absence. It started with Greg. He was always one of those quiet types, the kind of guy who kept to himself, but still managed to show up every day, always on time, always working. He was predictable, a fixture in the office, and we all took that for granted. But then, one morning, he wasn't there. At first, no one thought much of it. People are late, right? We assumed he had an early meeting or perhaps just overslept. But when lunchtime came and Greg still hadn't shown up, there was a shift. The air in the office felt a little colder, a little heavier. No one said anything, but we were all thinking the same thing. Where is he? It wasn't like Greg to miss work, not without saying something. We all knew he had a steady routine. If anything, we would get the occasional update from him about a missed deadline or a meeting delay. But now, nothing. At around 3 o'clock, I walked by his desk, hoping to see some sign of him. Maybe his laptop was open or a coffee mug left behind. But his desk was eerily neat, like he had just stepped away. His chair was empty, the papers on his desk still organized in a way that suggested he hadn't even moved them that morning. His coffee cup, always half full by mid-morning, sat there untouched, still waiting for him to return. I stood there for a while, staring at the stillness. The longer I stood, the more uneasy I felt, like the desk was silently accusing me of not noticing earlier, of not caring enough. I turned to walk away, but then I noticed something strange. His phone was plugged in, charging. It wasn't like Greg to leave his phone unattended. I walked back to his desk, picked it up, and checked the lock screen. The last message on his phone was from his wife, sent at 7:30 that morning. "Have a great day, love you." Nothing else. No missed calls, no other messages. Just the last, mundane check-in with his wife, completely ordinary. It didn't sit right. The phone should have been with him, shouldn't it? Maybe he'd stepped out for a moment, maybe to grab lunch, but it was almost 4 in the afternoon. Greg was usually a creature of habit, never deviating from his routine. So where was he? I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I walked back to my desk. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The office, once bustling with the usual hum of keyboards and muted conversations, felt strangely distant. People still worked, but I noticed they were more focused on their screens than usual, avoiding eye contact. As the day went on, the worry began to set in. Greg didn't call, didn't text anyone. He didn't even check in with his manager, which was completely out of character for him. By the time the workday ended, the unease had escalated into something more profound. The next day, there was still no word from Greg. No explanation, no messages, no call to say he wouldn't be in. His phone remained at his desk, still plugged in. I tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. I wasn't the only one starting to feel the weight of this odd disappearance. Other colleagues had started to notice the same strange things. His coat was still hanging in the cloakroom, his desk was still in the same neat state, and the files he had been working on were untouched, exactly as he had left them the day before. And then, 2 days after Greg's disappearance, something happened that would make the whole situation far more unsettling. I was sitting at my desk, working through a report, when my phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. The message was simple. "Are you looking for me?" I froze. My stomach tightened. I didn't recognize the number. My first instinct was to ignore it, to dismiss it as some kind of prank. But something made me open the message. I read it again. It was sent from Greg's phone. The same number that had been charging at his desk. It didn't make sense. How could it be possible? Greg had been missing for 2 days. The last time anyone saw him was when he left the office. He hadn't returned to get his things, so how was his phone sending messages? I stared at the screen, my fingers trembling as I typed a response. "Greg? Where are you? What's going on?" The reply came almost immediately. "I'm right here. You just need to look closer." I blinked, my pulse quickening. I glanced around the office. No one seemed to notice. No one seemed to care. Everything appeared normal. But it wasn't. I had just received a message from a phone that had been left behind by a man who had disappeared. I couldn't sit still any longer. I got up, walked to the corner of the office, and looked around. My eyes scanned every face. But no one seemed out of place. Everyone was immersed in their work, moving about their business. It was like nothing had changed. But something had. Something that I couldn't quite grasp. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise as I realized Greg might be gone, but someone was still here. And whatever it wasn't finished yet. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I sat at home, replaying the messages in my mind. "I'm right here. You just need to look closer." They lingered, echoing in my head like a distant whisper, pulling me into a spiral of doubt and confusion. I kept thinking about the phone. It didn't make sense. If Greg was truly gone, who was sending messages from his number? And why was the text so cryptic, so unnerving? At work the next morning, I couldn't ignore the knot in my stomach. I walked in, trying to act normal, but there was an undercurrent of unease in the office. Colleagues were whispering among themselves, casting furtive glances in my direction. They all had the same question on their minds, but no one dared to voice it aloud. I walked past Greg's desk again. The phone was gone. The empty space where his phone had been sitting felt strangely hollow, like the desk itself was holding its breath. It was unsettling how quickly things could change. Just yesterday, I had walked past that desk, saw it untouched, but now, today, it felt as if the very memory of his absence was starting to shift. His things were still there, his coat, his mug, but now, his phone was missing. I tried not to think about it too much, but I couldn't ignore the fact that someone had been using Greg's phone. The strange, cryptic text the day before wasn't the only one. As the day dragged on, I received another message. This time, there was no question, no vague cryptic phrase, just a location, behind the building. Now, my heart raced. I looked around. No one else seemed to notice, but I was frozen, staring at the screen of my phone. Behind the building? Was it Greg? Or was it someone or something else? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something I couldn't control. I didn't know whether I was being reckless or just desperate for answers, but I grabbed my coat and headed out the door. It was a cold, gray afternoon, and the usual hum of the office was barely audible behind me. I walked through the parking lot, my footsteps echoing louder than usual as I made my way to the back of the building. It was eerily quiet, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. The wind had picked up, but there was something strange about it. The chill in the air felt unnatural, like the weather itself was reacting to my nerves. I rounded the corner, glancing around. There was nothing. Just the dark alley behind the building, littered with forgotten cardboard boxes and an abandoned dumpster. No one in sight. I checked my phone. No new messages. It was as though the world had stopped. And then I saw it. A shadow in the corner of my vision. At first, it seemed like nothing, just a flicker, a trick of the light. But then it moved. Slowly, deliberately. A figure stepped out from behind the dumpster. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was tall, cloaked in a dark hoodie, its face obscured by the shadows. It moved toward me, deliberately, like it knew I would be here. "Greg?" I called out, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. It kept walking toward me, its movements strangely calm, almost robotic. It was as though it wasn't truly human. I backed away, heart pounding, mind racing for any explanation. Was it really Greg? Or was this someone or something else entirely? I didn't want to believe it, but the idea of it being Greg didn't feel right. The way he moved was wrong, unnaturally slow, like a puppet on strings. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It stood still for a moment, as though sensing my fear, before slowly raising its hand. It pointed directly at me. I stood there, paralyzed, unable to move. The chill in the air deepened, like the atmosphere itself was thickening around me, closing in. The figure remained silent, and I felt my breath catch in my chest. Suddenly, the phone in my pocket buzzed again. I reached for it, not daring to look away from the figure. The text on the screen sent a wave of dread coursing through me. "You shouldn't have come here." Before I could respond, the figure turned and disappeared into the shadows, vanishing just as quickly as it had appeared. My hands shook as I stood there, unable to move, staring into the empty space behind the building. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Who was that? Why had it appeared in front of me? I stumbled back toward the building, desperately trying to calm my racing thoughts. I looked around again, hoping to see someone else, anyone who could explain this, but there was no one. The parking lot was empty. The office windows were dark. I was alone. I felt a sense of dread creep in as I entered the building, but it wasn't just fear, it was something worse. Something was following me. Something was watching me. And it was clear that whoever, or whatever, had been sending those messages wasn't finished with me yet. The hours that followed felt like a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. My thoughts kept drifting back to the figure behind the building and the strange text messages. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain. When I returned to my desk, I sat down but didn't even bother to open my laptop. My fingers hovered over my phone, my mind racing. I knew I had to be careful. I couldn't just ignore what had happened, but at the same time, I didn't know if I could trust my own perception anymore. Was I being paranoid? Or was something really happening that I couldn't understand? Around noon, the phone buzzed again. A new message. I see you. It sent a cold chill down my spine. It was from Greg's number. But why was it so personal, so unsettling? Who was doing this? And what did they want from me? I looked around the office. Everyone seemed absorbed in their work. No one seemed to notice the subtle tension in the air. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I needed to know the truth. I couldn't stay in that office any longer. I grabbed my coat again and headed for the door, making a quick decision. Whatever was happening, I needed to confront it, even if I didn't understand it. This time, I wasn't heading for the back of the building. I walked toward Greg's apartment, hoping to find something that would explain his sudden disappearance. The evening was colder than usual, and the streets felt unnervingly quiet as I made my way through the city. The closer I got to Greg's apartment, the more anxious I became. The feeling of being watched was growing, the pressure on my chest tightening with every step. When I arrived at his building, I stood outside for a moment, staring at the dark windows. His place looked just as empty as it had that morning. No lights, no sign of life. But as I looked closer, I noticed something strange, a faint glow from the back window. I hesitated before walking up to the door. Was I making a mistake by being here? What was I expecting to find? I tried to push the doubts aside. I had to know what had happened to Greg. I rang the doorbell, but there was no answer. The building was silent. My heart was racing now, my thoughts tumbling over each other. Something didn't feel right. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, my phone buzzed again. Another text. I'm not gone. I'm right here, waiting for you. My breath caught in my throat. The message was from Greg's number again, but this time there was no ambiguity. It was as if the message had been meant specifically for me. Suddenly, the front door of the building creaked open. My head snapped toward it. It was Greg, or someone who looked like him. His face was pale, his eyes empty, like he was a shadow of himself. He didn't speak, but the message was clear. He was waiting for me. I froze, unable to move, unable to process what I was seeing. Was this real? Or was it another illusion, another trick of the mind? I took a step forward, then another, slowly approaching him. As I got closer, I could see that his clothes were disheveled, his hair wild, like he hadn't slept in days. Greg? I whispered. What happened to you? His lips moved, but no sound came out. He pointed toward the hallway behind him, then slowly backed away, as if inviting me in. I stood there, unsure of what to do. Should I follow him? Was this really Greg, or was something else using his body? I stepped inside, driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity. The hallway was dark, the air thick with a strange smell, like cold, stale air. My footsteps echoed in the silence as I walked deeper into the apartment. Every instinct told me to turn back, but I couldn't. I had to know what was going on. Greg, if it was really him, led me to the living room. The lights flickered on, revealing a room that looked almost normal. But the moment I stepped inside, something felt off. The walls were covered in strange, hastily drawn symbols. The furniture was overturned, scattered across the floor as though someone had been searching for something. Greg didn't speak, but his eyes followed me, his gaze unwavering. I couldn't help but feel that he wasn't fully aware of what was happening. It was like he was trapped in a dream, or worse, caught in something beyond his control. Then, the phone in my pocket buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a text. The call was coming from Greg's number. I stared at the screen, my hand shaking. My instinct screamed at me not to answer, but I couldn't resist. I pressed the green button and held the phone to my ear. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. There was silence on the other end for a moment, then a voice, low, distant, distorted. "You shouldn't have come here. You're too late." The voice was unmistakable, but it wasn't Greg. It was something else. A presence, a force that seemed to surround me. Before I could respond, the call ended abruptly, leaving only the eerie silence of the apartment. The weight of the moment pressed on me, and I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. Suddenly, Greg moved. He took a slow step toward me, his eyes wide with something. Fear? Relief? I couldn't tell. Then, everything went black. I woke up to the sound of muffled voices, distant and incomprehensible. My head was spinning, my body heavy. Slowly, I opened my eyes. The world was dark, but not completely. I could make out vague shapes, furniture, shadows, the outline of a window. I was still in Greg's apartment. But everything had changed. The air was thicker now, colder. The smell of stale air was stronger, mixing with something metallic, like blood. My heart skipped a beat. I scrambled to my feet, my legs weak. The room was different from how it had been before. The symbols on the walls weren't just hastily drawn, they were alive, pulsating, as though they were breathing. I stumbled forward, my breath shallow, trying to make sense of what was happening. Where was Greg? What had happened to me? My mind raced, but nothing seemed to fit. There was only one thing that was clear: I wasn't alone. The voices, now clearer, were coming from the hallway. I couldn't understand them, but they were there, murmuring in low tones. Fear twisted inside me, but I had to know. I had to understand what was happening. I approached the hallway cautiously, the floor creaking under my feet. As I moved deeper into the apartment, the voices grew louder, but they didn't seem to be coming from anyone in the apartment. They felt distant, like they were coming from somewhere far away, or somewhere inside my head. Then I saw him. Greg. He was standing at the end of the hall, staring into the darkness. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. His eyes were wide open, but empty, as though whatever had happened to him had drained everything that made him human. His body was rigid, unnaturally still. I called out to him, my voice hoarse. "Greg?" His head snapped to the side, his eyes locking onto mine. There was no recognition in them. No warmth. Just cold, hollow emptiness. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Instead, there was a low, guttural sound, like something was being dragged across the floor, like nails scraping against stone. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath quickening. Something was wrong, so wrong. I turned to run, but the hallway seemed to stretch on, the walls bending and warping as if the apartment itself was alive, changing shape. The door at the end of the hallway was now gone, replaced by a dark, endless void. It pulled at me, beckoning me in. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over my own feet. My hands reached out for something, anything to hold on to. My fingers brushed against the walls, but they felt like they were made of wet clay, slick and shifting beneath my touch. Then, the phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, trembling. A message. You should never have come here. It's too late for you now. The words burned into my mind. I turned to face Greg, but he was gone. The hallway was empty. The silence was suffocating, and the air was thick with dread. I looked around, desperate for an escape. The front door was gone, and the apartment seemed to close in around me. The shadows on the walls twisted into figures, stretching and warping, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. I turned back to the phone, my finger hovering over the screen. But before I could read the message again, the floor beneath me cracked. A loud, sickening sound echoed through the apartment, and I felt myself being pulled downward. The darkness consumed me. I woke up with a jolt, gasping for air. My heart was pounding in my chest, my body drenched in cold sweat. The apartment was still dark, but the sense of unease was gone, replaced by a suffocating silence. I was no longer in the hallway, no longer caught in the twisting nightmare. I was back in the office. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering intermittently. My desk was exactly where I had left it, the familiar clutter of papers, coffee cups, and my half-open laptop staring back at me. My fingers gripped the edge of the desk, as though to ground myself in something real. But it wasn't real. None of it felt real anymore. My phone was lying in front of me, the screen cracked and smudged, the glow of a new message notification blinking at me from the corner. The same message from Greg's number. You should never have come here. It's too late for you now. The words sent a chill through me. My hand shook as I swiped to unlock the screen. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, trying to understand what was happening. I dialed Greg's number, hoping to hear his voice. To hear something, anything, that would explain what had happened. The call rang, but when it picked up, it wasn't Greg's voice I heard. It was static. A low, distorted noise, followed by a voice that was not Greg's. You've seen too much, the voice whispered, chillingly familiar, but not quite right. You've opened the door, and now there's no turning back. The line went dead. I stared at the phone in disbelief, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I tried calling again, but the number was no longer available. No matter how many times I dialed, the call wouldn't go through. I stood up from my desk, my legs unsteady beneath me. The office was eerily quiet, the usual hum of conversation and the clatter of keyboards absent. I was alone, but I could feel something else in the air, something waiting. I walked down the hall to the break room, hoping to find someone, anyone. But when I entered, I froze in place. The room was dark, the blinds drawn tight. A figure stood at the counter, its back to me. It wasn't anyone I recognized. It was Greg. His body was stiff, his hands gripping the edge of the counter as though he were trying to hold himself together. His head was down, but when he turned slowly, his eyes met mine. There was no recognition in them. No life. Greg? I whispered, stepping forward, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. His lips parted, but the sound that came out wasn't his voice. It was the same distorted whisper from the phone. You should never have come here. It's too late for you now. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure, Greg, took a step toward me, his movements jerky, unnatural. The air around me thickened, and I felt the pressure of something closing in. Something watching me, waiting. Then, as if in a trance, Greg's hand reached out to touch me. I flinched, expecting a cold, clammy touch, but there was nothing. No sensation at all. His hand passed right through me, like I wasn't even there. I gasped, stumbling back. The room around me flickered, images of the office, the hallway, the walls themselves, all shifting and distorting. The shadows seemed to close in, and I heard the faintest sound. The whisper again. You're already here. And you'll never leave. I turned and ran, the office now a maze, the walls pulsating, the air thick with dread. My footsteps echoed in the empty halls, but there was no escape. The hallway stretched on, the doorways closing, the windows vanishing. I was trapped. Trapped in a world that wasn't real. Trapped by something I couldn't understand. And no matter how hard I ran, I could never escape. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the blinking screen of my phone, one last message from Greg's number. It's too late for you now. Have you ever heard a voice from nowhere? A voice so soft, so subtle, that at first you question whether you imagined it? I had no idea what I was getting into that night. But, as it turned out, I should have listened to that nagging feeling in the back of my mind. It started innocently enough, an ordinary night in an ordinary house. I had just gotten home after a long day at work, and I was looking forward to some peace. The apartment was quiet, the kind of silence that wraps you up and feels comforting. I settled into my bed, the soft hum of the city outside my window, and drifted into sleep. But then, something disturbed that quiet. It wasn't loud. No, it was a whisper, a soft, barely noticeable sound. I opened my eyes, the room still dim with the glow of the streetlights outside. My heart rate picked up, not from fear, but from confusion. I wasn't sure at first where it was coming from, but it wasn't outside. It wasn't from the street or the other rooms. It was from within the room. The whisper grew slightly louder, almost like a breath, but it wasn't just random noise. It felt deliberate, like someone was trying to say something. I turned my head, scanning the room for any sign of life. The shadows in the corners of the room remained still, undisturbed. The room was otherwise unchanged, yet the whisper persisted. It seemed to be coming from the corner of the room near the bed, right by the wall where the electrical outlets were. The air felt thick, oppressive. I listened harder, straining to catch the words. Sarah. I froze. My name. I had heard it clearly. No, I hadn't imagined it. The whisper was faint, almost like a sigh, but unmistakable. I sat up in bed, my eyes wide with sudden unease. I stared at the outlet across the room. It was just a normal, everyday outlet, nothing unusual about it. Yet, in that moment, it felt as though it was pulsing with some kind of strange energy. Was it the house settling? A trick of the wind? Maybe my tired mind was playing tricks on me. I tried to shake the feeling off, telling myself I was imagining things. But the whisper came again, this time clearer. Sarah. My breath caught in my throat. It was unmistakable. I wasn't alone. There was something in the room with me. But what was it? I reached for my phone on the nightstand, trembling slightly. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it, but something in my gut told me I needed to record it. Maybe I was just paranoid, but what if something was wrong? What if this was real? I opened the voice memo app and hit record. My hand hovered near the outlet, waiting, watching, listening. And then it came again. This time, the voice was clearer, more distinct, yet still, it had the same unnatural quality to it. Sarah. My stomach churned. It wasn't my imagination. This was happening. I wasn't alone. But there was no one here. The room was empty. The silence that followed felt suffocating. I stopped the recording, the screen of my phone glowing back at me. I felt my pulse quicken as I replayed the recording. And there it was, in perfect clarity. The voice. My name. Sarah. I pressed the stop button, but the words still echoed in my mind. Who could have been in the room? I was alone. I was sure of it. No one could have entered without me hearing them. I needed to investigate. I got out of bed, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. I walked over to the wall, kneeling beside the outlet. The room was too quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. I touched the outlet. It was warm, too warm. I pulled my hand back, my breath hitching. Was it the wires inside? A malfunction? I tried to reason with myself, but the whisper, my name, continued to reverberate in my ears. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and my mind raced to understand what was happening. But I wasn't prepared for what would come next. The room seemed to shift. The shadows in the corners deepened, the air thickening. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And then the whisper came again. But this time, it wasn't just my name. It was a command. Get out. My body froze. The voice, clear and sharp, echoed in the room, not just in my ears, but in my very bones. I hadn't imagined it this time. It wasn't just a whisper, it was a command. Get out. I couldn't breathe. My eyes darted to the doorway, the exit. But the thought of moving, of leaving the room, felt wrong. It was as if some unseen force was rooting me to the spot, paralyzing me with fear. I could almost feel the presence, its weight pressing down on the air around me. For a long moment, I just stood there, not knowing what to do. My phone was still in my hand, the recording app open, but I couldn't bring myself to press stop. My fingers trembled, and my heart thudded against my ribs. I replayed the audio once more. My name, then the command, as chilling as before. I thought about my options. Should I leave? Call someone? But who would believe me? Could I even trust anyone with this strange occurrence? I felt as if I was trapped in a world where the rules had changed and the normal boundaries of reality were shifting, dissolving. Then, another sound. It was barely audible, but unmistakable. A crackling, like static from a radio, followed by a low hum. My phone screen flickered briefly, then went dark. My pulse quickened. I hurriedly checked the device. The screen was blank. I pressed the power button, but nothing happened. I cursed under my breath. Whatever had happened to the outlet, it was now affecting my phone too. I moved away from the wall, my eyes never leaving the spot where the outlet was. My head spun with questions. Why was this happening? What was that voice? Who or what was in my room? I turned, pacing. It was then that I noticed something strange in the corner. It had been there all along, but I hadn't seen it in the dim light of the room. A shadow, long and distorted, stretching unnaturally across the floor. It didn't make sense. The shadows in my room were usually still, but this one moved. Ever so slightly. I blinked and stepped forward cautiously, my gaze locked on that corner where the darkness seemed to deepen. Was it just my eyes playing tricks on me? No. The shadow was there. It was growing. I reached for the light switch by the door, my hand shaking. With a flick of my fingers, the room lit up. For a second, I felt a rush of relief until I saw the shadow again, still there, even in the bright light. It had shifted, but there was no source for it. The light was coming from the ceiling, from a bulb that illuminated the entire room. So why did the shadow remain? I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. This had to be a trick of the mind, some side effect of the stress I'd been under lately. I was overthinking, reacting to my fear. I was just tired. Maybe it was the heat from the outlet playing with my senses. But then, the whisper came again. Sarah. This time, it wasn't in the room. No, it was closer. It came from inside my head. My breath hitched. It felt as though the voice was pressing against my thoughts, seeping into my mind. It was no longer just a sound in the air. It was an invasive presence, mingling with my thoughts, pulling me toward the edge of my sanity. Sarah, get out. The voice wasn't coming from the outlet anymore. It was everywhere. In a burst of panic, I turned and sprinted to the door. My hand fumbled for the handle, but the door wouldn't open. It was locked. I didn't remember locking it. I didn't remember ever locking it. No, no, no. I pulled at the handle with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. I pounded on the door, shouting, hoping someone would hear me, but the silence in the room was deafening. I was alone. I was completely, utterly alone. I glanced back at the wall. The shadow was still there. It stretched longer now, twisting unnaturally across the floor toward me. It was moving toward me, as if it had a will of its own. And then, a soft click. I turned back to the door. The handle shifted. It was unlocked. I rushed out of the room without looking back, my legs carrying me down the hallway of my apartment. I didn't stop until I reached the elevator. But even as I pressed the button, something deep inside me knew that the nightmare wasn't over. I had left the room, but I hadn't left the voice. It was still there. I could feel it, just beyond the door, waiting for me to return. The elevator doors slid open with a soft ding. I stepped inside, pressing the button for the ground floor. The familiar hum of the elevator comforted me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The voice was with me, following me, just out of sight. The elevator descended slowly, the soft chime of each floor passing. But I wasn't focused on the floors. I was focused on the reflection in the polished metal walls. Behind me, in the gleaming surface, I saw something that wasn't there in the real world. A figure. It wasn't my reflection. It wasn't anyone I recognized. It was a silhouette, standing just behind me in the elevator. I turned, but there was no one there. The doors opened, and I stepped out into the lobby. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me, following me. The voice. That voice. It was still in my mind, and it wouldn't leave. I hurried out of the building, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no particular destination in mind. I just needed to get away, to feel some distance from that thing. The voice. The shadow. My thoughts were a jumble of confusion and terror, but one thing was clear: I wasn't safe. I wandered through the quiet streets of my neighborhood, the night air cold against my skin. The usual sounds of the city were muffled, as though the world around me had gone silent. The hum of the traffic, the distant chatter of people, it was all gone. In its place was an oppressive quiet that weighed heavily on my shoulders. I needed to calm down, to think clearly. But with every step I took, I could feel that presence, the voice, following me. It was inside my head, a constant murmur, growing louder, more insistent. Sarah. It whispered, its tone so familiar, so intimate. Sarah, come back. I flinched at the sound, my skin crawling. I wanted to scream, to run away, but where could I go? There was no escape. I had to face whatever this was, whatever had followed me home. I pulled out my phone, desperate for something to distract me, to give me a sense of control. As I unlocked the screen, my heart skipped a beat. I had several unread messages, all from my own number. I stared at the screen, confused. How could I be receiving messages from myself? I hadn't sent any. The first message read, "Come home, Sarah." I didn't know what to think. My hands trembled as I scrolled down to the next one. "I'm waiting for you." I felt my breath catch in my throat. Whoever, or whatever, was doing this, it knew me. It knew my name, my fears. It was inside my life. I quickly opened the next message. "You don't need to run." The words seemed to vibrate on the screen, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "It's already too late." The last message was just a series of strange symbols, like a code. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of them, but I couldn't. My phone felt suddenly alien in my hands. I had to get away from it. I needed to think. Without another word, I turned and rushed back to my apartment. Each step was heavy with dread. I was being hunted, stalked by something I couldn't explain. The messages from my own phone, my own number, were proof that the nightmare had followed me out of my room, out of my apartment, into my real world. The line between reality and whatever was tormenting me was blurring. I arrived back at my building and made my way up the stairs, feeling as though the walls were closing in on me with every step. I unlocked my door, then hesitated. The silence of the apartment was too much, too still. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was inside, waiting. I walked in slowly, keeping my hand on the door handle. The apartment looked unchanged. Everything was exactly as I had left it, until I reached the bedroom. There was something new on the floor. A small, blackened object, like a piece of charred paper. I knelt down to pick it up, but as I did, something moved in the corner of my eye. A shadow. It was fleeting, just a brief movement in the corner, but it was enough. I snapped my head to the side, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. But my heart was racing. I stood up, the paper clutched in my hand. I unfurled it slowly, my fingers trembling. The writing was scrawled in jagged, erratic handwriting. "You can't escape." I froze, the words staring back at me. My pulse quickened, and the oppressive air of the room seemed to grow heavier. The voice was back, louder now, almost mocking. "I'm here, Sarah. I'm always here." It was then that I heard it, footsteps. Soft, deliberate, and echoing from somewhere deep in the apartment. They were unmistakable, and they were coming closer. Slowly, with an eerie rhythm, as if someone, or something, was moving deliberately toward me. I wasn't alone. I turned, my back to the door, my mind racing for an explanation. My eyes darted around the room, trying to pick up any clue of what was happening, any sign of where the footsteps were coming from. There was no one there, nothing I could see. But I could feel it. That presence. I stepped backward, heart hammering in my chest, until I was up against the wall. The footsteps stopped, but the air was thick with tension, as if something was just waiting, watching me. And then, nothing. Silence. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted for the door, but as I reached for the handle, the voice came again. Not yet. It wasn't just in my head this time. It was in the room, like a physical presence, a force. I spun around, my eyes searching for any sign of it. The room was empty. The apartment was empty. But I wasn't. I stood in the middle of the room, breathless, my mind racing. The air felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. There was nothing visible, nothing that I could point to, but the weight of the room felt wrong. The footsteps had stopped. The silence was more unsettling than the sounds had been. My heart still pounded in my chest, every beat seeming to echo in my ears. I didn't know what to do next. The messages from my phone, the eerie whispers from the socket, and now, these footsteps. It felt like something was moving closer, circling me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I glanced around the room again, as if expecting something to jump out at me. But nothing. Just the silence. Just the hum of my own breath. I forced myself to take a step forward, then another. I reached the door slowly, my hand hovering over the handle, but I couldn't bring myself to turn it. I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making, yet none of it felt real. It was like I was stuck between worlds, where logic and reason no longer applied. The voice. The whispers. They were becoming more frequent, more urgent. Each whisper seemed like it was coming from somewhere deeper, more intimate, as though the walls themselves were calling my name. Sarah. Sarah. Come to me. The words sent a chill up my spine, and I couldn't stop myself from backing away. My feet were moving before I even realized it, backing up toward the bed, then the corner of the room, until there was nowhere left to retreat. I reached out instinctively, grabbing the nearest object for protection, a lamp. I had no idea what I was planning to do with it. What could I possibly do against this? A lamp wasn't going to save me from whatever force was in this room. But it gave me some sense of control, however fleeting. I had to make sense of this. I couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding. I had to confront it. Whatever it was. Then, as if in response to my thoughts, I heard a noise behind me, soft, barely audible at first. The sound of something moving, something shifting. I turned around, gripping the lamp in both hands. There, in the shadows, a figure emerged. It was tall, featureless, like a silhouette of smoke or a shadow cast by the dim light. It was there. But it wasn't. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was so distorted, like it wasn't fully in this world, and yet it was. It was real, but it wasn't. The edges of its form flickered and warped like the static from an old TV screen, and it made no sound as it moved toward me. "Sarah, it's time," the voice echoed, this time not from the socket, but from the figure itself. My grip on the lamp tightened, but I didn't know what to do. I was frozen, unable to move. The figure came closer, the whispering filling my ears, the sound like 1,000 voices murmuring all at once. It was a chorus of whispers, each one indistinct, overlapping, but all of them saying my name. "Sarah." I closed my eyes, the fear overwhelming me. This wasn't real. I couldn't let it be real. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, to push the thoughts away, I couldn't escape the feeling that this thing, whatever it was not only real but knew me. It knew me in a way that no one could. The voice grew louder, the whispers becoming a cacophony, all of them chanting my name in unison. "Sarah. Sarah. Sarah." I opened my eyes, and it was right in front of me. I didn't know how it happened, but in a split second, I was no longer holding the lamp. It had slipped from my fingers as though something invisible had yanked it away. My arms hung limply at my sides, my body betraying me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was trapped, not physically but mentally, frozen in place, held by the grip of something I couldn't comprehend. And then, the figure spoke again, its voice no longer a whisper but a low, almost affectionate tone. "You're mine now." The words sent a wave of nausea through me. I stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. I crashed into the wall, and for a moment, I thought I might fall through it. The sensation was so disorienting, like my very sense of space was being distorted. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. Vanished. The room was still. But the feeling remained. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the place where the figure had been, waiting for it to return, for the whispers to begin again. But the silence only deepened, pressing on me, suffocating me. Finally, I dared to move. Slowly, cautiously, I made my way to the door. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle. I had to leave. I had to get out. But as I opened the door, something caught my eye. It was a small note, taped to the doorframe, written in the same jagged handwriting as the note I'd found earlier. "I'm always watching." I froze. My heart stopped. The voice from the socket. It was still here. It had never left. I stood frozen in the doorway, the note still clutched in my shaking hand. The words "I'm always watching" danced before my eyes, like they were burning into my vision, relentless, unyielding. Was I going insane? It felt like I was. I wanted to scream, to tear down the walls and run far away from this house, this room, from the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't end. But I couldn't. There was nowhere to run. I backed away from the door, stumbling, barely keeping my balance. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my mind was racing, searching for any explanation, anything that would make sense of what was happening. But there was no answer. Nothing made sense anymore. I turned, my eyes scanning the room one more time, as though expecting something to pop out of the shadows. But the room was empty, quiet, save for the soft hum of the electrical appliances. The same hum that had once seemed ordinary, but now felt like an ominous presence. I moved cautiously toward the bed, my feet dragging, as though I was wading through molasses. I needed to think. I needed to figure out what to do next. And then, I remembered the recordings. I rushed to my phone, pulling it out of my pocket with trembling hands. The voice from the socket, the one that had whispered my name, had called me. I opened the audio file. My breath caught in my throat when I hit play. At first, it was just static, a low, buzzing hum like a broken speaker. But then I heard it. Clear as day. Sarah. My own name, spoken in a voice I didn't recognize. It wasn't distorted by static or distortion. It was too clear. Too perfect. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't breathe. Sarah, it's too late now. The voice came through even clearer this time, and as it did, a chill swept through me. It wasn't just a whisper. It was alive. It was like the air itself was speaking to me, curling its words around my ears. I could almost feel it moving, a presence beyond the phone, beyond the walls, beyond the house. I dropped the phone. It hit the floor with a soft thud, but I couldn't look away. The words were still echoing in my mind. It's too late now. It was like a warning. Or was it an inevitability? Something that was meant to happen. I backed away, eyes darting around the room, searching for some kind of escape. The walls seemed to close in again, the room shrinking, becoming suffocating. I rushed to the door, heart pounding in my chest. The hallway outside was dark, quiet, but I didn't care anymore. I needed to get out of this house, away from the whispers, away from whatever it was that had been haunting me. But as I reached the door, something stopped me. The air around me shifted. The silence was too thick now, like the room was holding its breath, waiting for something. And then, the light flickered. Once. Twice. 3 times. I spun around, eyes wide, searching for the source. There was nothing there, no wires or exposed bulbs, no explanation for the strange flickering. But I could feel it. Something was about to happen. Before I could react, the voice came again. But this time, it wasn't just coming from the phone. It was coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from the very floor beneath my feet. You can't escape, Sarah. It was everywhere. It was in my mind. It was in my soul. I couldn't take it anymore. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, my body trembling. I ran. I ran down the hallway, into the living room, out the front door, and into the cold night air. But even as I ran, I could still hear the voice. It wasn't just inside the house anymore. It was outside too. The voice was everywhere, all around me, inescapable. Sarah, you will never be free. I stumbled through the yard, my legs weak beneath me, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare stop. As I reached the gate, the whispers intensified. They grew louder, more frantic, more desperate. It's not over. The voice hissed, and suddenly, the ground beneath me seemed to shift. It was like the earth itself was alive, reaching up to drag me back into the nightmare. But then, I heard something else. A sound so jarring, so out of place, that I froze. It was the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from behind me. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. A figure stood at the end of the driveway. It was dark, but I could make out its shape, a tall, thin silhouette, completely still. The faintest glimmer of moonlight caught its features, and for a moment I thought I saw nothing. Just an empty void. But the figure moved. It took a step toward me, and with each step, the whispers grew louder. The sound of my own heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning everything else out. I didn't know what was happening, or who that figure was, But I knew one thing, it wasn't over. Not yet. And I wasn't safe. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.